February 5th, 1878. Alexander McSween left Mesilla on horseback with a lawful hearing behind him and a set of accusations still hanging over his name, and he rode toward Lincoln knowing the next move would be made in his absence. The case centered on the estate of Emil Fritz and the proceeds of a life insurance policy, money McSween had been hired to collect and protect, then demanded by the men running the county's dominant trading house. In that fight, paper orders were ignored unless a badge and a gun enforced them. McSween's ride north began in winter conditions that punished mistakes. A rider had to guard the horse's legs, the saddle's fit, and every strap, because a broken cinch in remote country meant walking. Nights dropped hard in temperature, and a man who failed to find shelter could wake with stiff hands and swollen joints. Water was not evenly spaced, and the open stretches between settlements forced travelers to plan every stop. McSween moved with the urgency of someone who could not afford delays, but he still had to work within the limits of distance, terrain, and the endurance of his mount. The dispute he carried with him was rooted in money large enough to pull powerful men into the open. The policy itself was for $10,000 issued by Merchants Life Insurance Company of New York. Collecting it had required travel, lawyers, and banks, and the money was handled through distant financial channels before it could be used by the heirs. The big store, the operation identified in Lincoln as the House of Murphy, and then the firm led by James Dolan, treated Fritz's policy as a source of control. If McSween could be forced to surrender it on their terms or be destroyed for refusing, it would reinforce their position with every debtor and every rival watching. The big store had tools beyond argument. Its leaders were not only merchants, they were moneylenders, contract bidders, and political allies. Thomas B. Catron, a leading territorial lawyer, backed the firm, and the company's influence reached high enough that Territorial Governor Samuel Axtell borrowed $1,800 from it. Their power traveled through credit lines and contracts, but it also traveled through the county's law enforcement structure when it needed to. Sheriff William J. Brady sat at the center of the local enforcement side. District Attorney William Reinerson and other officials farther south had roles that could be pulled into a civil dispute when criminal language served the goal. McSween knew that legal procedure could be used as a weapon, because he had already felt it used against him. Affidavits were gathered from Fritz's family members to claim wrongdoing, and a civil suit was pushed alongside criminal claims. The result was an arrest warrant, and then the pressure of custody and bond. A man could lose months of freedom while the underlying dispute stayed unresolved. That was leverage the House wanted, and it was leverage that could be applied without firing a shot. Lincoln itself was a small town stretched along the Rio Bonito, a ribbon of adobe buildings, corrals, and fenced yards pressed close to a single main street. The county seat had courts, a jail, and the offices that gave documents their force. It also sat close to Fort Stanton and the Mescalero Reservation, places tied to government supply contracts. The same county that held cattle, farms, and mines also held federal money, because posts and agencies needed beef, grain, and freight hauled in. Whoever controlled procurement and credit could turn that public spending into private leverage, and the big store had built its dominance on that connection. John Henry Tunstall's presence as a competing merchant threatened that system. He ran a store in Lincoln that offered an alternative to Dolan's counter, and he operated a ranch on the Rio Feliz south of town. He worked with McSween and aligned with John Cheatham, a cattleman whose herds and capital gave the rival group strength. Tunstall's business did not need to match the big store in size to cause damage. It only needed to pull customers away and prove that the house was not the only gate to supplies, credit, and contracts. That challenge sharpened existing grudges. Some men in town depended on the big store for credit and were trapped by it, while others resented being squeezed and wanted a new option. Loyalties were personal and practical at the same time. A rancher who owed Dolan money might speak politely to Tunstall in daylight and still report his movements at night. An employee of the big store could be sworn in as a deputy and use that temporary authority to settle a private dispute. A young cowboy could choose a side based on wages, friendship, or fear, then find himself forced to keep that choice when violence followed. After days in the saddle, McSween entered Lincoln and found that the pressure had already increased. Sheriff Brady had moved to attach McSween's property as security in the civil dispute, and McSween was held in custody until bond could be made. An attachment was not a calm notice pinned to a wall. It was deputies standing in a store, goods counted and listed, and a man being told he could not step freely into what he believed was his own. It was the sheriff's office used to freeze a rival's ability to operate, while Dolan's side kept trading and collecting. The same pressure was turned against Tunstall's assets. Brady attached livestock belonging to Tunstall, even when the grounds for doing so were thin. In Lincoln County, livestock meant movement and survival. Horses were transport, labor, and escape, and they were also the quickest form of portable value. Taking a man's horses could strip him of mobility and force him to accept terms he would otherwise reject. Taking a man's cattle could collapse his ability to pay hands and suppliers. The attachment turned property into a hostage, and it did it under a legal banner that discouraged neighbors from intervening. Tunstall did not accept the seizure as a quiet loss. He appealed directly to Brady and pressed for release of part of what had been taken. Brady agreed to release some of the animals, and Tunstall moved them out of town at once. He drove them back to his ranch on the Rio Feliz, keeping them away from the corral gates and the street corners where deputies could appear without warning. The move was defensive, not a display. It was an attempt to keep property from being swallowed by a process controlled by men who hated his presence. The ranch did not feel like safety. The Rio Feliz Valley could hide riders until they were close, and open stretches offered little cover if gunfire started. The same distances that kept a sheriff's man from arriving quickly also kept help from arriving quickly. A rancher faced a problem when the law itself was aligned against him because the badge could travel with the posse. A man who resisted could be labeled a criminal even if he was protecting his own stock. That risk was built into every encounter between a rival businessman and a sheriff who chose a faction. Word reached Tunstall from his cowboys that Brady had sent a posse toward the ranch again, aiming to serve a writ and seize livestock a second time. The warning carried details that made it hard to ignore. A posse could include men who were sworn deputies for the day, along with fighters tied to Dolan's side, including gunmen who were known for doing violence when asked. Such men did not ride out only to read legal language. They rode out to take, and they expected compliance because they believed the sheriff's office would protect them later. Tunstall faced a narrow set of options. If he stayed at the ranch, the posse could corner him on open ground and force a confrontation away from witnesses. If he scattered his stock farther, he risked losing it to theft and confusion, and he also risked having his movements treated as evidence of guilt. If he rode to Lincoln, he could press his case closer to the county seat, but he would be riding into a place where Dolan's people and Brady's deputies were concentrated. Every choice carried danger, and the men pressing him understood that. On the morning of February 18th, Tunstall set out toward Lincoln with a small group of his hands. Richard Brewer rode with him. William Bonney rode with them as well, the young man whose later notoriety would eclipse his earlier role as a hired hand. Other men associated with Tunstall's outfit were close enough to be tied to the day in later accounts, and the names commonly connected to the ride include John Middleton, Henry Newton Brown, Robert A. Weidenman, and Fred Waite. They moved with horses that represented real value, and in a county where attachments could strip a man fast, moving horses away from seizure could feel like the only practical defense left. The way men travel while driving horses creates vulnerability. A herd must be kept moving and kept together, and that requires spacing. One rider takes the lead and watches the trail. Another swings wide to keep animals from breaking off. Another stays behind to push stragglers forward. In that spread, a leader can end up riding ahead, and the men behind can be separated by uneven ground and brush. A posse approaching at speed can choose the moment to close, and the target may not have time to pull his men into a single defensive knot. The terrain south of Lincoln offered natural traps. Washes and arroyos cut the ground and forced riders into predictable crossings. Low rises and stands of brush offered concealment for men who knew the route. The valley narrowed in places, and the trail could pinch riders close to rock and brush. In February, the air was cold enough to carry sound, but wind and distance could still mask the first approach of hooves. A rider focused on keeping a herd aligned could miss the change in rhythm until the pursuers were already near. The posse met Tunstall on the trail. It carried the authority of Brady's office through deputized men, and it carried the practical authority of guns in saddle scabbards and revolvers on belts. Some of the men were attached to Dolan's faction, and some were known for gunplay and intimidation. A posse built for an attachment had no reason to be gentle. Its purpose was to seize property, and its members expected the law to shield them when they used force. The encounter did not stay within the boundaries of civil procedure. Tunstall was confronted, and the situation turned into an armed clash. When a writ is served in a county where the sheriff's loyalty is questioned, the moment is loaded with threat. A target who yields loses property and standing. A target who resists can be claimed as obstructing the law. The posse can fire and then describe its actions in the language of duty. That structure made it possible for violence to be treated as enforcement, even when it looked like murder to the men who watched it happen. Shots were fired. Rifle cracks split the air and echoed off the valley walls. The smell of burned powder mixed with the smell of sweat and horse. Horses reacted with panic, jerking against reins, shying and trying to bolt. A spooked animal can turn a man's attempt at defense into chaos, and chaos favors the larger group. A man who falls in open ground is exposed to gunfire and to hooves, and the dirt under him offers no protection. Tunstall was struck and went down with a fatal wound. Sworn statements gathered in the wake of the killing placed the fatal shots with Tom Hill and William S. Buck Morton, men riding with the posse that had come under the sheriff's authority. The paperwork that justified the ride did not change the result on the ground. A merchant lay dead on the trail, and the men who had ridden him down expected the county's power structure to absorb the consequences. The men riding with Tunstall were placed in an impossible position. They could see their employer fall. They could recognize faces in the posse. They also faced a larger, armed group that could claim official authority. Charging into that fire would have been suicide. Holding position in the open would have been suicide as well. They had to withdraw, using whatever cover and distance they could find, then regroup with the knowledge that they had just watched a killing they were not allowed to prevent. The posse's advantage did not end with the fatal shot. A posse that had come to seize property could still complete its purpose after the target was dead. The line between seizure and theft was thin when the sheriff's allies controlled the paperwork. A dead man could not dispute inventories, and a rival could not rely on the county officers to preserve evidence. In a conflict where the law itself was part of the faction, the scene of the killing could be controlled by the same men who created it. News of Tunstall's death reached Lincoln quickly. Riders carried it down the valley. Men at the big store heard it from deputies. Men aligned with McSween heard it from terrified hands. The town's single street made the spread faster because every doorway faced the same road and every errand passed the same corners. People who had been watching the legal conflict recognized the shift at once. A civil dispute over property and money had produced a dead merchant on a trail. and the men responsible were tied to the sheriff's circle and to Dolan's side. Sheriff Brady showed no urgency to investigate his own posse with the determination expected after a murder. That response was a practical statement of alignment. It told Tunstall's friends and employees that the county's enforcement arm would not protect them. It also told Dolan's allies that the risk of consequence remained low. In a county where the same men wrote inventories, filed returns, and wore badges, inaction could be as decisive as action. For Tunstall's people, the killing forced immediate decisions. They had to secure themselves against arrest and retaliation. They had to protect whatever stock and supplies were still under their control. They had to consider which neighbors could be trusted and which would report them. They also had to decide whether to accept the sheriff's version of events or to seek their own form of justice. The law had been used to corner their employer and then to erase him, and there was no sign that official process would provide relief. By the end of February 18th, the road into Lincoln had become a place where riders watched for posses and gunfire, not only for freight wagons and trade. The killing on the trail had shown how quickly an armed group could trap a man while saying it acted under a writ. The factions now had a body to point to, a scene to describe, and names that would be spoken in every conversation. The next stage would not be decided only in courtrooms and stores. It would be decided by armed men taking positions and refusing to be moved. Cold light came over the ridges south of Lincoln on Tuesday, February 19th, 1878, and it laid bare the consequences of a killing that had already begun to split the county. A dead rancher lay on the trail, a dead horse lay nearby, and the ground held a clear record: hoof prints, boot tracks, dragged dirt, and scattered cartridge cases. Men in Lincoln County could read sign the way a clerk read handwriting. They did not need a courtroom to understand violence, but they needed a courtroom record to fight the sheriff's version of events. Rancher John Newcomb helped lead the party that went out to recover the body. They brought rope and a mule because there was no wagon road that could be trusted through the brakes and brush. They spoke little and worked fast. The coat and trousers were stiff with dust and dried blood. The dead horse was already rigid, the hide dark where bullets had struck. The men kept watches on the ridges and in the timbered draws, since a second strike could come quickly in country where an armed rider could move without being seen. The recovery party reached Lincoln with the corpse still bound across the mule. People came out from houses, stores, and corrals, drawn by the sight and by the certainty that the killing would not be contained. Alexander McSween took charge of the body and moved it under shelter, determined to keep the sheriff from seizing it as evidence to be handled on the sheriff's terms. Lincoln had no formal morgue, only rooms and outbuildings, and whoever controlled the corpse controlled the first hours of the narrative. In a county where law was used as leverage, even a dead man became contested property. Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson became the key official for McSween's side. Wilson convened a coroner's jury and opened an inquest while tracks were still sharp and witnesses were still in town. Statements were sworn and written down. Names were put on the record: Jesse Evans, Buck Morton, Tom Hill, and other men tied to Sheriff William Brady's force and to James Dolan's protection. The verdict named the killing as murder, not lawful arrest, and that single word carried consequences because it authorized warrants against men the sheriff treated as his own. Wilson's courtroom was a small room with men crowded close, hats in hands or still on heads, boots leaving dust on the floor, and a clerk's pen scratching steadily. Each sworn statement was a risk. A witness who named a deputy sheriff could be arrested on a pretext, beaten, or shot on a lonely road. Yet the statements were given anyway because the alternative was silence and a closed file. The coroner's jury listened, then returned its finding in writing. The verdict did not end argument. It started it, since it forced the county to choose whether paper law would be enforced or ignored. With the inquest record in hand, Wilson issued arrest warrants and placed them in the hands of Town Constable Atanasio Martinez. Martinez had the duty to serve them, and he had to decide whether to do that work cautiously or openly. He chose open service because secrecy could be painted as criminal intent. Martinez deputized men to accompany him, and William Bonney and Fred Waite rode at his side with firearms visible and with the confidence of men who believed paper authority would hold against a county sheriff. The approach to the Murphy-Dolan store was a deliberate test. The building was close to Brady's allies, and armed deputies drifted in and out of the area. Martinez presented the warrants and demanded the surrender of the men named. Brady refused. He denied Martinez's authority to arrest his deputies and denied Wilson's power to reach into the sheriff's command. Brady's men disarmed Martinez, Bonney, and Waite. Warrants and deputy constable language did not prevent hands from taking rifles and pistols away, and they did not prevent the sheriff from placing the 3 men under arrest and having them taken to confinement. Lincoln's jail was a pit in the ground, a dugout meant to hold prisoners with minimal expense and maximum degradation. Damp earth smell mixed with human waste and old food. Light reached down only in thin strips. The air stayed cold and stale, and a man could not stand upright without crouching or bending. Bonney and Waite stayed in that pit while the men they had tried to arrest moved in the open street above. Martinez was released first. Bonney and Waite remained confined for 2 more days, long enough to make their arrest a public spectacle and to warn anyone who challenged Brady's control. In the pit, time moved slowly. A man measured the hours by footsteps overhead and by the shift of light at the opening. Food came down in poor portions. Water was passed in whatever container a guard chose to use. The pit did more than confine. It isolated because a prisoner could not speak to allies without a guard listening. Bonney and Waite had to decide whether to remain quiet or protest and invite harsher treatment. They chose to endure, knowing that the men above ground were watching for signs of weakness and watching for an excuse to crush resistance. On Wednesday, February 20th, Fort Stanton's assistant post surgeon, Lieutenant Daniel M. Appel, performed a post-mortem and embalmed the body. The work was done with the tools of a frontier garrison, instruments in a case, preservative chemicals, bandages, and careful stitching. The point was not ceremony. The point was time, to keep decay from destroying the face and to keep the body presentable for viewing and transport. McSween wrote to the family in England that the embalmed corpse looked natural, and he did it for the same reason he demanded an inquest, to build a record that could not be erased by fear, bribery, or a bullet. On Thursday, February 21st, John Tunstall was buried behind his store. His friends chose that place instead of the town's Catholic cemetery, putting him on ground tied to his name. Men stood through cold air and watched shovelfuls of dirt fall, then watched who lingered and who walked away quickly. Local tradition held that the coffin was lined with lead to preserve the body for eventual transport to England, and the story circulated because it captured the intent behind the burial. The grave was meant as temporary, even while the feud made every plan uncertain. On Friday, February 23rd, Bonney and Waite were released from the pit. They came out without the firearms Brady had taken. The loss left them disarmed, angry, and publicly humiliated. They did not seek redress through Brady's office. They returned to McSween's circle and to the men who still spoke of enforcing the warrants by any means left to them. Federal Deputy Marshal Robert A. Weidenman pressed a separate line of authority. He sought support from Fort Stanton, and soldiers assisted him in a search for men connected to the Evans faction, a move that signaled the feud could pull military force into a private war. Weidenman did not rely on talk. He arranged for armed support and used it. He also put new paper in men's hands. Bonney and Waite, just freed from Brady's custody, were among those he deputized under federal authority, turning them into a marshal's posse for the purpose of serving process. The arrangement was unstable by design. It let Weidenman move against men connected to the Evans faction without asking Brady for cooperation. It also placed federal authority and county authority in direct conflict inside the same streets with rifles on both sides. The search did not produce the men Weidenman wanted. Fugitives in Lincoln County had friends in hiding places, and they understood how to use doorways, lofts, cellars, and brush lines beyond town. Still, the operation changed the balance of fear. Brady's faction had to watch soldiers take positions and had to watch a deputy marshal carry out searches that the county sheriff did not command. McSween's faction took it as proof that Brady's authority could be challenged, even if only for a night. The town absorbed the lesson that law was no longer a single chain of command. On Saturday, March 1st, Wilson escalated again. He appointed Dick Brewer as a deputy constable, and Brewer began swearing in men as his posse. Those men called themselves the Regulators, a name that signaled their claim to enforce order through warrants when the sheriff would not. They carried lever-action rifles and revolvers, the common arms of the territory. A repeating rifle could fire multiple rounds before reloading, and the advantage was obvious whenever a rider had to keep pressure on an enemy in open ground or in brush where a pause could invite a countercharge. The Regulators drew men with different temperaments but the same immediate goal. Frank McNabb and John Middleton rode with Brewer. George Coe and Frank Coe added knowledge of the country and its people. Charlie Boder and Doc Skurlock brought hard-fighting reputations. Jim French carried strength and a steady willingness to stand in the open when bullets started. No single man in that group held a monopoly on violence. Their power came from acting together under a commission, showing the papers when it helped, then relying on rifles when papers meant nothing to the men they were sent to arrest. Brewer led the Regulators into the broken country of Lincoln County, where a man could disappear within a mile if he knew the draws and the water. River bottoms carried brush thick enough to hide riders. Flats held wind that blurred tracks. Rock cuts offered positions for ambush. The men being hunted knew the same ground and could move from ranch to ranch, trading horses and shelter. The chase became a grind of short leads and long rides, men eating dry rations, drinking from cold streams, and sleeping in their clothes with rifles close at hand. On Thursday, March 6th, the chase reached the Rio Penasco area. The Regulators located Buck Morton with Dick Lloyd and Frank Baker. Morton and Baker were deputy sheriffs under Brady's commission. Morton had been named in the sworn accusations tied to the killing. Baker rode with him and moved within the same armed circle. The Regulators moved in to arrest, and the meeting turned into a running fight that carried for 5 miles. Horses surged through open ground. Riders leaned forward and fired from the saddle. Men tried to cut angles to block escape routes, while others held straight pursuit to prevent a break into the timber. Morton's surrender came with a condition. He demanded a promise that he and Baker would be taken alive back to Lincoln. Brewer gave that assurance. The promise served a practical purpose. A man expecting immediate execution fought harder and killed more men before he went down. The promise also created a new problem because it forced the Regulators to transport prisoners through a county full of hostile friends. The Regulators placed the prisoners in the middle of the column and kept rifles ready. They rode with eyes scanning ridges and for motion in the brush. The march back with prisoners forced constant calculations. A guard who relaxed for one moment could lose a rifle to a sudden lunge. A guard who rode too close could be shot by a rescuer aiming for the prisoner and missing. The column chose routes that offered water and cover, yet every bend could conceal rifles. Night camps were arranged with horses tied close and men posted on watch. Since an enemy could ride in silently and cut lead ropes, stampeding the mounts and leaving the posse stranded with prisoners and no way to move fast. William McCloskey rode with the regulators during the transport, and his presence added strain. McCloskey had friendships that crossed faction lines, and in a county where both sides recruited from the same ranches, that kind of connection could turn into suspicion. Men watched each other as closely as they watched the prisoners. Each pause in the column brought eyes scanning for ambush points, cottonwoods that could hide rifles, dry washes that could swallow riders until the moment they rose. Guards kept themselves positioned to see the prisoners' hands and to keep a weapon from being snatched during a brief moment of distraction. On Sunday, March 9th, the transport reached a stretch of country known as Agua Negra, Blackwater, where dark water cut through low banks and brush and timber broke sightlines. Morton and Baker did not reach Lincoln alive, neither did McCloskey. The regulators returned with the dead and delivered a straightforward official account. The prisoners attempted escape, and the guards shot to stop them. They also claimed that McCloskey sided with the prisoners during the attempt and died in the same burst of violence. News of the deaths traveled back into Lincoln fast, and it carried a clear message. Legal process was now being decided in the field by armed men. Later that same Sunday, Territorial Governor Samuel B. Axtell attacked the legal footing beneath the regulators. He declared that John B. Wilson had been improperly appointed, undermining Wilson's warrants and appointments. The order did not disarm anyone. It gave Brady's faction a legal argument to label the regulators criminals, and it pushed the county deeper into a fight where both sides could claim badges and both sides could shoot under the claim of law. March 10th, 1878 began in Lincoln with armed men moving openly and watching every doorway. Main Street was a hard dirt road lined with low adobe buildings with flat roofs and narrow windows. Doors opened straight onto the road. Hitching posts, wagons, and loose animals crowded the frontage. Corrals and fenced lots sat behind the stores. Gaps between buildings and back alleys gave cover to anyone who wanted to move unseen. Hoofbeats, wagon rims, and shouted warnings carried from end to end. Official process became a tool of attack. Warrants, summonses, and deputations were used to seize property, arrest enemies, and justify armed raids. Different officials declared different documents valid, and those declarations changed quickly. Men who depended on courts learned that paper orders did not stop a rifle shot. Men who carried rifles learned that paper orders still put names on lists and created posses that rode hard and asked questions later. Sheriff William J. Brady stayed in Lincoln and moved with deputies close to his shoulders. He crossed the street in daylight, past doors where hostile faces watched, and watched every window for the sudden outline of a rifle muzzle. His deputies carried pistols and kept long guns close. The badge on a vest did not calm the street. It drew attention and built a target. Beyond Lincoln, riders moved along river bottoms and across open flats carrying news from camp to camp and shifting men from one hiding place to another. Some families tried to keep cattle fed and children indoors when strangers rode past. Other men traveled in groups, armed and ready, convinced that hiding alone meant being found, disarmed and jailed. Dry washes, brush lines, and bends in the Rio Bonito helped riders break sight lines and lose pursuers. On March 14th, violence broke out near Tularosa. Tom Hill and Jesse Evans confronted a sheep drover while trying to rob the camp. Gunfire followed. Hill was killed. Evans was badly wounded and carried toward Fort Stanton for medical treatment. The incident showed that the county's conflict was spreading into robberies, stock theft, and personal vengeance, all under the same clouds of armed authority. Evans did not gain safety at Fort Stanton. While he was being treated, he was arrested on an older federal warrant connected to stock theft from an Indian reservation. That arrest placed him under federal process even as local riders continued to hunt and retaliate across Lincoln County. The overlap of authority produced argument instead of order because a man held for one offense became leverage in a different dispute. In Lincoln, the next court date drew attention because it threatened to shift power without gunfire. A grand jury session was scheduled for April 1st. Men expected testimony, indictments, and arrest warrants tied to leading figures. Those expectations pulled armed allies into town. Some arrived to protect friends. Some arrived to intimidate witnesses. Others came to watch and decide whether they needed to leave the county before the next round of papers turned into the next round of bullets. Daily life continued under that pressure. Storekeepers stocked shelves and kept ledgers while armed customers stood at counters with revolvers on their hips. Meals were served in rooms where rifles leaned against the wall beside chairs. Horses were fed and watered while men scanned the street and rooftops. Adobe walls were thick, but windows and doors turned a home into an opening that gunfire could reach. Late in March, confusion deepened when United States Marshal John E. Sherman reinstated Robert Weidenman as a deputy marshal, restoring his federal status. The move added another badge to a town already crowded with men claiming authority. Federal and territorial power did not line up in a single chain, and each side treated the other's papers as threats. Men who expected one law began to plan for a place where no single law controlled the street. As April drew near, armed men slept in shifts. A sentry listened for horses at night and watched for lamps that moved where they should not be. In the morning, men checked revolvers, counted cartridges, and stepped into the street with eyes on rooflines and alley mouths. No one talked freely in public. Conversations happened in back rooms and behind corrals, where a stranger's ears were less likely to be close. April 1st arrived with too many armed men close together. Sheriff Brady stepped into Main Street with 4 deputies and headed toward the courthouse. They walked in daylight because the business of the court demanded it, and because delaying the walk signaled weakness. The street offered little cover. Anyone crossing it was exposed from the moment boots left a doorway. Behind an adobe wall near the Tunstall store property and its corral, 6 regulators waited in concealment. Jim French, Frank McNabb, John Middleton, Fred Waite, Henry Newton Brown, and William H. Bonney, known as Billy the Kid, had chosen a position that gave cover and a clear angle into the street. Mud brick hid their bodies and protected them from return fire. They watched Brady approach and held their fire until he and his deputies entered the open stretch where there was no quick shelter. When Brady reached that ground, the regulators opened fire. Bullets struck flesh, ripped cloth, and kicked dust from the road. Brady was hit and fell. Deputy George W. Hindman was shot and went down, mortally wounded. The deputies in the open tried to return fire, but they had to shoot while moving, while ducking, and while trying not to be cut down beside the men already on the ground. Deputy Jacob B. Matthews fired toward the wall and toward any sign of movement above it. Other deputies shot as well, aiming at muzzle flashes and shifting shadows. Their bullets punched into adobe and sent chips and dust into the air. The shooters behind the wall stayed protected and kept firing from cover. Smoke drifted low in the street. The sound of rifle shots cracked against the flat fronts of the buildings and bounced back into the bodies of the men in the open. Brady suffered at least a dozen gunshot wounds. Hinman took 2 fatal hits. The volley was sustained fire meant to kill quickly and prevent rescue. Brady's body lay in the road while the deputies tried to avoid being pinned down beside him. The open street became a narrow corridor where men either crawled, ran, or died standing. Men in doorways slammed shutters and pulled children back from windows. Horses jerked at reins and tried to bolt when bullets snapped past their ears. Seconds after the first volley, Billy the Kid and Fred Waite broke cover and ran into the street toward Brady's body. They moved fast and directly, trying to seize what Brady carried. Brady had a warrant connected to Alexander McSween, a piece of paper that could be used to justify arrests. Brady also held property that his enemies wanted back. That rush pulled Billy and Waite into the deputies' line of fire with no wall between them and the rifles aimed their way. Matthews fired again. The bullet passed through Billy the Kid's right thigh and shattered Waite's leg. Both men fell, then dragged themselves back toward cover while return shots snapped through the dust. Other regulators pulled away from the wall and the group escaped as the street filled with shouted commands. Soldiers from Fort Stanton moved toward Lincoln after the ambush, but the gunmen were already out of town before a military presence could influence the scene. Brady lay dead in the road and Heineman lay dying nearby, and the town's authority collapsed into anger and fear. The deaths in the street sharpened the conflict instead of ending it. Brady's supporters called it an execution of a sitting sheriff in daylight. Brady's enemies called it removal of a man they considered a threat. The courthouse day that was meant to produce legal decisions had produced dead officers and wounded men, and each side treated that outcome as proof that compromise was finished. The flight from Lincoln required fast decisions. Small groups used backlots and the edges of town, then rode into country where tracks faded quickly in hard ground and dry sand. Pursuers questioned townspeople, looked for fresh hoofprints, and scanned ridges for dust trails. A delay of minutes meant losing the only visible sign of direction because riders who reached a bend in the river bottom or a brushy draw broke contact and vanished. The regulators headed southwest and stayed away from Lincoln Center. They traveled light and kept rifles close, using the country's folds to stay out of sight. Their movement had a purpose beyond escape. They carried a list of men they wanted to arrest or remove, and they believed that leaving certain opponents alive meant facing those same opponents again with new warrants and new guns. On that list was Andrew L. Roberts, known as Buckshot Roberts. He was older than many of the young gunmen riding the county, and he carried a long injury in his shoulder that limited how he handled a rifle. He did not run a faction or make speeches. He kept to his own work and tried to avoid being pulled deeper into the feud, but his name on that list made him a moving target. On April 2nd, Roberts sold his small ranch claim and expected payment to arrive by mail. The check was to be delivered at the post office at Blazer's Mill, a sawmill and trading post on the Mescalero Apache Reservation that also served as a supply point for the surrounding country. Roberts planned to collect the money and leave the county, and he traveled with a mule and a pack horse carrying what he owned. Blazer's Mill sat near a creek with a cluster of adobe buildings and work areas that served the sawmill and the agency. The largest structure was a 2-story adobe agency house with rooms used for meals, store goods, and office work. Smaller 1-story adobes stood nearby. A corral area sat across the creek. The place was busy in daylight and quiet at night, and it drew travelers who needed mail, supplies, or shelter. Early on Thursday, April 4th, Roberts reached the mill and went straight to the post office. He asked for his check and was told it had not arrived. Dr. Joseph Hoy Blazer invited him to sit and visit while he waited. Roberts lingered because leaving without the money meant starting over with only a mule, a pack horse, and a few personal items. After waiting, Roberts started away from the settlement. He then saw riders approaching and recognized the regulators. He slipped among trees to keep out of sight and let them pass. The sight of their rifles and their numbers told him that any contact in the open meant death, and he kept his animals moving until the riders cleared his view. Then he saw the mail buckboard heading toward the post office. Roberts turned back, convinced the check was on that incoming load. He rode down toward the buildings and crossed the creek where 3 teenage boys were tending horses. Almer Blazer, Cy Maxwell, and Willie Pitts. The boys were busy with the animals and did not warn him that armed men were settling into the agency house. The regulators arrived at the mill late in the morning as a party of 19. Dr. Blazer greeted them and arranged for food. Clara Godfroy operated the restaurant in the front of the agency house, and the men sat at a long table and ate while their rifles rested within reach. They leaned long guns against an inside wall and kept revolvers close to their belts. They expected trouble and they organized themselves for it. The boys led the regulator horses across the creek and placed them in the corral south of the big house. The corral sat low enough that horses were not obvious from the higher ground on the approach. Riders coming in from a ridge did not see a clear line of saddled animals and misjudged how many armed men were on the property. The creek, the dip in the ground, and the buildings combined to hide the scale of the party. From a distance, the buildings and cottonwoods hid armed men until they were close. Roberts crossed the creek again and tied his pack horse to a tree, then rode his mule down toward the agency buildings. He approached the hitching post with no weapon in his hands. When he saw the line of rifles inside, he understood he had ridden into the center of the men hunting him. Roberts knew Blazer preferred visitors to leave guns outside. He unbuckled his pistol belt and hung it on the saddle horn, and his rifle stayed in its scabbard. Those small acts left him exposed at the worst moment. He stepped toward the doorway with empty hands while men inside had rifles close enough to grab in a heartbeat. The confrontation moved from words to gunfire with little distance between the first demand and the first shot. Roberts was hit early. He turned and reached a nearby adobe room used as an office and got inside. The doorway was narrow and the walls were thick, and he used the room as his only chance to stay alive against a larger group. Inside the office, Roberts found a single-shot Springfield rifle chambered for the .45-70 cartridge and a box of ammunition. He shoved a mattress against the door to block entry and took position behind it, turning the small room into a fortified space with one access point. He loaded, aimed, and waited for a target to appear. Outside, the regulators fired into the office area, trying to punch bullets through wood and adobe and force Roberts to stop shooting. Inside, Roberts returned fire with a steady rhythm that matched the single-shot rifle. Load, aim, fire, reload. Smoke collected in the room. Dust fell from the ceiling and drifted into his eyes with every impact. The exchange scattered fighters across the yard. Men dropped behind corners, hugged adobe walls, and used the slight dips in the ground near the creek. Roberts's bullets hit hard. Dick Brewer was killed. John Middleton was shot in the chest. Doc Skurlock and Frank Coe were wounded. George Coe's hand was mangled. Billy the Kid was wounded as well, and the group's ability to fight as a unit broke under the pressure of the sustained return fire. By the time the shooting slowed on April 4th, Blazer's mill had turned from a work site into a killing ground. One wounded man in a small room, armed with a single-shot Springfield and protected by a mattress against the door, held off a larger group long enough to kill and wound several of them. The regulators rode away carrying their dead and helping their wounded, and Lincoln County stayed on a course toward more bloodshed. April 5, 1878 opened with Lincoln County running on nerves and rumor, and the gap between a lawful arrest and a revenge ride narrowing by the hour. Men carried papers in coat pockets and rifles across saddles, and they spoke of authority while choosing ground the way hunters chose blinds. The regulators were no longer a single riding party moving as one. Wounds, military detention, and the pressure of warrants had broken them into smaller knots that met in secret and moved in short bursts. Because any long ride in daylight could be watched, named, and intercepted. Frank McNabb took the captain's work and forced order onto men who wanted to scatter. He picked meeting places away from Lincoln, set hard rules for watch, and demanded that nobody drift into town alone to gather news. Lincoln was a place where a face could be recognized at a window, and a messenger could be on horseback before a visitor cleared the hitching rail. McNabb kept camps mobile, never bedding down twice in the same hollow, never leaving a fire burning long enough for smoke to betray a location, and never letting horses stay saddled where a sudden flight would leave a man fumbling with cinches under fire. The legal machinery in Lincoln did not slow the violence, it reshaped it. A courthouse session could turn into a night ride because a name written on a page gave men an excuse to form a posse and ride under color of law. Witnesses stayed close to adobe walls and spoke in low voices because any statement that named a deputy or a gunman could be answered with a gun barrel pressed into a doorway. The county's conflict moved into a phase where the same man could be called a criminal in one room and a deputy in another, depending on who held the pen and who controlled the hallway. Federal authority threaded through the same chaos. In the territory, it was common for county sheriffs and their men to hold commissions as special federal deputy marshals. That overlap turned disputes over a county badge into disputes over the federal star as well. Men who wanted to capture enemies did not only claim local authority, they claimed to be acting for the United States, and the paperwork was close enough to truth to confuse outsiders and intimidate locals. At Fort Stanton, the Army became the one force that could hold prisoners without being immediately overrun by a rival faction. The post sat close enough to Lincoln to influence events, but far enough to feel separate, a military island of discipline with cavalry horses in picket lines and sentries watching the gates. Men brought in under guard were searched, disarmed, and placed under military supervision, not because the Army wanted the county's quarrel, but because the quarrel kept forcing itself into the fort's yard. Robert Weidenman, a deputy United States Marshal drawn into the county's violence, did not trust the county's deputies to keep him alive. He turned himself into the military at Fort Stanton for protection, putting his safety in the hands of soldiers rather than in the hands of deputies aligned with Murphy and Dolan. The move showed how the county's struggle had reached a point where law officers needed protection from other law officers, and where a badge on one man's coat could make him a target for another man who carried a badge of his own. While the fort held men and letters moved between commanders, Lincoln kept tightening. Families shut shutters earlier, lamps were turned down sooner. Children were kept out of the road, and women moved along the edges of buildings using adobe corners as shields. Men learned to judge by hoofbeat cadence whether a rider was alone, whether a pair was pacing each other, or whether a cluster was pushing hard enough to mean a posse. Stores still opened, but customers kept one hand free, and conversations ended fast when someone stepped into the doorway and looked too long. The district court session and its associated proceedings became the county's nerve center. A courthouse crowded with armed men did not feel like a civil forum. It felt like a place where a man could be seized before he reached the judge's table, or where a witness could be marked for death simply by being seen speaking to a clerk. Deputies stood near doors. Friends stood behind them. Enemies watched from across the street. Every movement in and out of the building was observed and carried away by riders who did not need to be told what to do with a new name. On April 16th, an investigator's report reached the Attorney General in Washington, a formal document that tried to describe the mayhem and the political interference surrounding it. The report did not stop gunfire in Lincoln County, but its existence meant the conflict was now being watched by distant officials who understood that local law had collapsed. The war was no longer only a county feud, it had become a territorial embarrassment. On April 18th, a grand jury returned indictments that struck both factions. Men connected to the street ambush in Lincoln were charged. Men connected to the earlier killing that ignited the county's feud were also named. The courtroom language expanded the conflict from gunfire to warrants. Indictments did not settle guilt. They changed who could be seized and how fast. A man under indictment could be arrested on sight, and the arrest could be carried out by a posse that did not ask permission from neighbors or the army, because the paper itself became the permission. Those indictments forced tactical changes that could be seen in small details. Travel became more guarded, camp discipline tightened. Rifles showed up more often than pistols because a rifle gave reach in open country and power through adobe. Lever-action repeaters fed from a tube magazine allowed a man to keep firing while staying tight to cover. A single-shot rifle demanded a break in rhythm for every reload, and every break gave an enemy a second to move, close, or sprint to a doorway. Ammunition became a resource counted at night, parceled out with care and carried close to the body so it would not be lost in a sudden run. The justice of the peace position in Lincoln was also thrown into dispute by territorial intervention. Governor Samuel Axtell canceled the local justice's appointment, a move that undercut the legal foundation the regulators had used to claim they were acting under warrants. With that stroke, men who had been serving papers could be treated as men with no authority at all. The county's feud did not need the governor's decision to continue, but the decision gave one faction a cleaner argument for treating their opponents as outlaws instead of deputies. And it gave their posses a new confidence when they rode into a ranch yard with guns out. The sheriff's office became the county's most dangerous vacancy. Without a single accepted sheriff, every faction tried to fill the space with its own chain of command. Deputies already sworn under the old order did not lay down their authority, and men sworn under newer documents treated older commissions as worthless. Each side claimed law, and each side built its claim on the same tools, badges, affidavits, and armed men who could decide in the moment whether an arrest ended with handcuffs or with a corpse in the dirt. On April 27th, the Lincoln County Commissioners appointed John N. Copeland as sheriff. The appointment was a formal attempt to restore a single line of authority, but the office came with no automatic control over the armed men already riding the county. Copeland's first problem was immediate. Any arrest order he carried could trigger gunfire from whichever faction believed the order was aimed at them. His second problem was structural. The strongest armed groups were tied to the factions, and the factions were not looking for a neutral sheriff. They were looking for a sheriff who would serve their side. Copeland's appointment did not calm Lincoln. It created a new contest over which papers would be honored and which would be ignored. Some Murphy-Dolan men treated Copeland as a McSween choice and argued he never properly qualified. Some McSween men treated him as the county's legitimate sheriff and expected him to restrain the hostile deputies already riding with their enemies. Copeland could not satisfy either demand. He had to hold the jail, keep deputies from killing prisoners, and avoid being dragged into a street fight that would turn him into another dead sheriff with a badge pinned to a shirt soaked dark. A second chain of action ran alongside Copeland's official appointment. George W. Pepin, a deputy tied to the Murphy-Dolan side, remained active and influential among the armed men who wanted McSween's circle crushed. He did not need a new election to build a posse because in Lincoln County a man with friends and a stack of papers could swear in armed riders and call them deputies. Pepin's strength came from who would ride for him. Seven Rivers fighters, Jesse Evans men, and ranch hands willing to take temporary authority because it carried pay, protection, or a clear chance to strike enemies under the word deputy. By the last days of April, the Murphy-Dolan side shifted toward a plan built on trapping regulators outside Lincoln, far from adobe walls owned by friends. Scouts watched trails. Riders lingered at likely water stops. Men hid in brush where a horse could not see them and where a rider's eye would skim past unless he stopped and stared. The goal was to strike when a small party paused, when horses needed water, when a man's attention drifted from the ridgeline to the tack straps in the creek bank. The Rio Bonito corridor offered the ground an ambush needed. Cottonwoods and brush followed the water and broke sight lines. Low banks and shallow gullies gave men a place to lie flat with rifles pointed out. Ranch buildings and corrals created choke points where riders had to slow, dismount, or funnel through gaps. A concealed party could hold fire until targets were inside sure range, then unleash the first volley from both sides, forcing men to choose between surrender and a dash into open ground. On Monday, April 29th, Frank McNabb rode with Ab Saunders and Frank Coe along the Bonito in daylight. They moved without a larger escort, relying on speed, familiarity with the country, and the belief that they could read trouble early and break away. They carried weapons, but a moving rider loses advantage when enemies are already placed in waiting, because the first shots decide whether a man stays mounted long enough to reach cover. They stopped at the Fritz Ranch to water their horses. The stop put their attention on thirsty animals and tack, not on brush lines and low rises. Hidden men did not announce themselves with a warning. The ambush opened with gunfire from cover, sharp cracks that made horses jump and men flinch for any dip in the ground. McNabb broke for a gully line that offered a narrow route away from the center of fire. Bullets found him before he cleared the angle. He went down hard in the dirt and the shooting continued as the posse pressed its advantage, rifles barking, powder smoke curling low, dust spurting from the bank and the packed ground around him. Saunders was hit and dropped, then tried to drag himself toward shelter while blood spread into the soil beneath him. Coe fought while shifting for a position that kept him alive, but the ambush placement cut off clean escape routes and left him under converging fire from men who had chosen their ground in advance. When the firing slowed, the posse moved in cautiously with weapons leveled, closing on any place where a wounded man might still fire. McNabb was dead. Saunders lay wounded and could not be moved without worsening his condition. Frank Coe was taken prisoner. His weapons were stripped away. His hands were watched. He was pushed forward and kept under guard, because a captive who slips free can turn on his captors in a second, and a deputy badge does not stop a close-range shot. News of the Fritz Ranch ambush moved fast through Lincoln County, carried by riders and by the ordinary mail route that still tried to function through fear. The report did not arrive as a clean narrative. It arrived as raw facts. McNabb dead, Saunders wounded, Coe captured, and it landed in Lincoln like a match on dry grass. Men who had been holding back in town tightened their grips on rifles. Men who had been talking of surrender stopped talking. The county's fight was no longer a series of raids and arrests drifting across open range. It was becoming a struggle where travel itself could be a death sentence. Tuesday, April 30th brought Lincoln into a new level of volatility. 4 men connected to the Seven Rivers crowd, Tom Green, Charles Marshall, Jim Patterson, and John Galvin, were killed in town. The killings were decisive and left bodies quickly identified. Friends gathered with anger and firearms, and talk of retaliation moved through doorways and across yards faster than any official inquiry could begin. No court finding fixed responsibility for those 4 deaths. Accusations flew immediately. The Murphy and Dolan side blamed the regulators. The McSween side denied involvement. The practical result was not resolution, it was a sharper readiness to shoot first, because men believed the next attack could happen in daylight on the same street where families still tried to buy flour and feed. That same day, rifle fire reached across Lincoln itself. George Coe took position high enough to see far down the street and fired at Dutch Charlie Kruling. The shot crossed more than 350 yards of open distance and struck Kruling, proving that the street could be controlled from elevation by a steady shooter with a rifle braced against a roof edge. After that hit, men moved lower, stayed tighter to walls, and treated open ground as a killing lane. People who had been standing in doorways stepped back into rooms. Riders stopped crossing the street at a trot and began hugging buildings moving in short bursts, eyes scanning rooflines before they dared to shift. By the end of April 30th, the county held a sheriff appointed by commissioners and a rival force acting with its own deputies and its own plan. McNabb's death at the Fritz Ranch cut the regulators again and showed that ambush ground could be chosen and held by their enemies. With a new captain selected to replace him, the regulators faced a harder reality. Every ride risked a trap, and every step into Lincoln risked a courtroom turning into a firing line. May 15, 1878. South of Lincoln, at a cattle camp near Seven Rivers, the regulators arrived with hard faces and dusty horses, looking for a string of stolen mounts, and the search ended with a man dead on the ground and a larger fight started. The camp sat in open country where water and shade were never taken for granted. Low shelters and rough corrals marked the place, with tack hanging from rails and a cook fire that had seen too many strangers. The men there worked for outfits tied to the Dolan side of the county, and they had the kind of casual confidence that came from believing the law would not reach them in a meaningful way. Horses could be taken, hidden, traded, and ridden again before any court paper was even written. The regulators did not arrive to argue. They were there to take back horses that had been pulled away from men aligned with them, and they were there to send a message that theft had consequences when the target belonged to their side. They stripped the camp of a large number of animals, 27 by one count, and they moved fast, since every minute spent in the open was a minute that allowed a counter-posse to gather. Manuel Segovia, known in the county as Indian Segovia, was at that camp. He had run with Jesse Evans and had ties to the roaming gun crews that were used as muscle by the Dolan faction and its allies. He did not get loaded into a wagon for Lincoln and placed behind a jail door. He was shot where he was found, and the regulators rode away with the horses and left his body in the dirt. The killing did not reduce the violence. It raised the stakes. Seven Rivers was full of men who lived by force and answered to the same merchants and cattle interests that controlled credit and contracts in Lincoln. A death there could not be absorbed and forgotten. It had to be repaid, and repayment rarely came through the courts. In the weeks after Segovia fell, riders moved along the river valley with the careful pace of men who expected an ambush at any bend. Inside Lincoln, the road that served as Main Street did not look like a battlefield yet. It looked like a settlement trying to keep functioning. Adobe homes and businesses lined the packed dirt, with cottonwoods near the water and small garden plots behind fences. Yet the calm was thin. Men watched each other through doorways. People paused before stepping into the street, listening for hoofbeats and for voices that sounded wrong. Late in May, Frank Angel reached Lincoln as a special investigator. He came with a purpose that had nothing to do with local loyalties, at least in theory. He was there to gather sworn statements and report to higher authority, and his presence forced people to speak in formal language even as they carried private threats. He sat with men from both factions, took down their words, and had them swear to what they claimed. The ink did not cool the anger, but it changed how it was expressed, since a statement could later be read aloud in a courtroom or used as a reason for an arrest. Angel's work also exposed how thoroughly the conflict had infected basic government functions. A warrant in Lincoln County no longer meant an impartial arrest. It meant a paper excuse for armed men to surround a house. A badge no longer meant a promise of restraint. It meant access, and access meant advantage. With Angel listening, men tried to sound lawful while preparing to act lawless as soon as he left. On May 28, 1878, Governor Samuel Axtell issued a proclamation removing Sheriff John Copeland and appointing George Pepin as sheriff in his place. The proclamation traveled down from Santa Fe, and it was immediately felt in Lincoln. Copeland had not been elected by a county vote, and his removal did not come through a local election either. The power came from the territorial government, and the territorial government had long been aligned with the interests that backed Dolan and his circle. Pepin took office at the end of May, and the change was immediate. The badge shifted from a man seen as sympathetic to McSween to a man tied to the Dolan faction. Deputies were chosen with the same purpose. Some came from groups known for rustling and violent enforcement. A pin and a proclamation turned men with reputations for theft into men who could claim they were acting under authority. For residents who wanted no part of either side, many residents saw their options narrow fast. A settler who needed credit had to deal with the store that could deny him supplies. A rancher who needed legal process had to deal with deputies who might also be the same men raiding his herd at night. Complaints could be answered with ridicule or threats. The official channels of the county were now tools used inside the feud. Early June brought a strained quiet while Angel finished his interviews and prepared to leave. People moved cautiously, knowing that any shooting during an investigation could bring outside consequences. The caution was never trust. It was calculation. Ammunition was still counted, horses were still kept close, doors were still barred at night. A local election restored John B. Wilson as Justice of the Peace in Lincoln. The office carried weight far beyond its modest title. A Justice of the Peace could issue warrants, and warrants could be used as leverage in a county where armed men obeyed paper only when it matched their interest. With Wilson back in that chair, each faction watched for the next set of warrants, knowing that the wrong signatures could decide who would be hunted. On June 8, 1878, William Bonney gave sworn testimony to Angel. The act of swearing to words in that atmosphere carried risk. Any statement could later be used in a courtroom, but it could also be used in a street fight. The testimony, along with the other statements Angel collected, did not resolve the conflict. It added more documented lines for each side to cite while they kept shooting. As soon as Angel left Lincoln, Pepin tried to move from paperwork to arrests. He wanted to seize the regulators not as a group of private gunmen, but as men he could label criminals under his newly recognized authority. He also wanted help from Fort Stanton, since soldiers could add force and create an appearance of neutrality that a posse of local gunmen could not. Fort Stanton stood close enough to Lincoln County's trouble to become part of it. Troops had already been used as escorts, and the commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dudley, had enough influence to shift the balance. When Pepin asked Dudley for military assistance to help arrest the regulators, Dudley agreed to provide troops under Lieutenant Goodwin. The meeting between soldiers and posse took place on the road between Stanton and Lincoln. The soldiers arrived in formation, disciplined and armed, and they saw immediately that Pepin's party included men known as outlaws and gunmen. Lieutenant Goodwin refused to join a civil arrest effort that was built around such a posse. Pepin argued, insisting he had lawful authority and promising to dismiss certain men once the force returned to Lincoln. Goodwin accepted the compromise, and the soldiers rode with Pepin's party under the understanding that the most compromised riders would be turned away before any attempt at arrests. The plan failed before it reached its target. News traveled faster than a mixed column of riders and troops. The regulators were warned and left Lincoln before Pepin returned. They did not leave in parade order. They slipped away as armed men slipped away now, using side routes, using darkness, and keeping distance between themselves so a single ambush could not end them all. Pepin rode into Lincoln with soldiers beside him and found the targets gone. The failure revealed how porous the town had become. Someone inside Lincoln had taken the risk of warning the men Pepin wanted. That meant information was flowing through households and businesses that Pepin could not fully control. The soldiers returned to Fort Stanton. Pepin was left with the same problem he had started with: a legal claim to authority and an inability to enforce it without increasing the number of armed men on his side. By late June, Lincoln County was attracting more gunmen every week. Some were recruited openly. Others came for pay without asking who was right. Men with little connection to Lincoln's families arrived and attached themselves to whichever side offered food, ammunition, and a place to sleep. The presence of outsiders made the danger worse, since they did not have to live with the consequences after the shooting, and they did not have long histories that could restrain them. The environment made every decision harsher. Summer heat settled over the valley. Dust rose from the road and hung in the air after every wagon. Water had to be carried and guarded. The river and its ditches kept small gardens alive. But those same willows and cottonwoods gave cover to men trying to approach unseen. In that landscape, a rifleman could get close, fire, and vanish into brush before anyone decided which direction the shots had come from. Inside Lincoln, the buildings themselves shaped the coming fight. Thick adobe walls absorbed bullets better than plank, and narrow windows limited angles of fire. Roofs were flat and reachable from ladders and adjoining structures. A man on a roof could watch the whole street and pick targets through gaps between buildings. A locked door could slow an entry long enough for defenders to shoot through it. A single structure, if defended by enough men, could hold out against a larger force that had to cross open ground. On July 2, 1878, a domestic dispute became public anger inside the feud. Susan McSween went to the house of Saturnino Baca and his wife Juana, who leased a house from the McSweens. Susan accused Saturnino of sending men to kill Alexander McSween and demanded that the Bacas vacate the house immediately. The confrontation struck the Bacas in the middle of ordinary life, with a pregnant wife and a household already strained by the county's fear and shortages. Susan later denied the outburst. Juana Baca and many people in Lincoln said it happened. In a town where reputations could decide who would be fed, sheltered, or protected, the story spread quickly. Women repeated it while drawing water and while trading food. Men repeated it at corrals and on store porches. The episode deepened hostility between the McSweens and neighbors who already resented them for politics, religion, and business conduct. After the July 2nd clash, the social lines in Lincoln tightened. Neutrality became harder to claim. A family renting a house could be forced to choose sides simply to keep a roof. A visit to a neighbor could be read as loyalty. A man seen speaking with a deputy could be labeled an informer. The settlement's small size made secrecy nearly impossible, and every new accusation narrowed the space where ordinary people could live without being pulled into the feud. Pepin kept building his force, using his sheriff's authority to deputize men and to offer protection to those who aligned with him. Dolan's store remained a center of supply, credit, and information. Those resources turned into weapons. Food could be denied, ammunition could be provided, a man's debt could be used to push him, and a man's fear of arrest could push him to join a posse simply to stay out of jail. On the McSween side, the large house in Lincoln became a place that could be held under fire. Its size made it attractive as a refuge, and its walls made it valuable as a strong point. Domestic comfort had to be rearranged for survival. Furniture was moved to clear lines of fire, supplies were gathered and stacked. Water storage was treated as a necessity rather than a convenience. Doors and windows became posts for armed men. Supporters arrived in small groups, careful not to bring a crowd that would trigger immediate attack. They carried ammunition, spare weapons, and information from the roads and ranches. They watched the street and the rooftops. They studied neighboring buildings, noting where a defender could fire without being exposed and where an attacker could approach with cover. Their planning was practical, aimed at living through a siege rather than winning a legal argument. Across the street, Dolan's side held positions tied to the store and other nearby buildings. They had access to supplies and to men who could be summoned from the countryside. They also faced a problem created by their own methods. Deputies drawn from gunmen and rustlers did not act as disciplined officers. They needed pay and they needed permission to take what they wanted. A sheriff who relied on such men had to keep feeding them, or they would drift, rob, or switch allegiance. As July advanced, the settlement filled with signs of an approaching fight. Men stopped carrying rifles casually and began keeping them within reach at all times. Riders approached Lincoln in pairs rather than alone. Night travel increased since darkness reduced the chance of being identified. Shots in the distance became common enough that many residents stopped reacting, which made sudden violence easier since nobody wanted to step outside and become the next target. By the second week of July, the county's tension had moved into Lincoln itself in a way that could not be ignored. The town was small, but it contained the buildings that both sides treated as essential. Whoever controlled the street controlled the county seat. Whoever controlled the county seat could shape courts, contracts, and the story told to Santa Fe. That was enough to keep armed men coming, even when they knew the street could fill with crossfire. On July 14, 1878, the day ended with the settlement braced for a siege. Doors stayed shut longer. People waited to move until they saw who was watching. Armed men checked their weapons and their ammunition in silence. The buildings stood unchanged, yet the way they were being used had changed completely, with firing angles chosen, roofs watched, and rooms cleared for defense. Lincoln was ready for sustained gunfire, and the people inside it knew the first shots of a larger battle could come with the next sunrise. July 15, 1878 sunrise hit Lincoln with a harsh wind blowing straight down the road, lifting pale dust off the hard ground and driving it into every doorway. The Rio Bonito ran close enough that damp air mixed with grit, turning sweat into a paste on faces and hands. The town sat in a narrow valley, buildings strung in a line on both sides of the street, adobe walls, low roofs, porches, corrals, and stacked firewood. Voices stayed low at first, then faded altogether because rifle barrels already pointed through narrow gaps, and every man waiting for trouble knew how fast a shout could become a target. Inside the McSween home, the air stayed cool and heavy. Sand-filled sacks had been pressed against doors and windows, leaving tight slits that showed only a slice of daylight. Furniture had been dragged into place to choke off angles, and loose boards were wedged where a bullet might slip through a crack. Cartridges sat in neat piles on shelves and on the floor beside knees, and men kept their rifles close enough that a hand could grab one without rising. A single shot outside would not sound like a single shot in here. It would come through the walls as a hammer blow and turn every breath into a pause. Susan McSween remained in the same confined space as the men guarding her household. She watched the defenders settle into routines that looked calm until a sudden noise snapped their heads toward the street. Some men chewed hard bread and swallowed it without speaking. Others took measured sips of water and set cups back in the same place, because the safe trip to a well or a ditch depended on timing that no one controlled. Blankets were rolled against interior walls to create dark corners for rest. Every movement inside the house was planned, close to adobe, close to furniture, close to anything that might stop a stray round. Farther east, the Ellis store held another cluster of defenders. They used the building with a deliberate rotation, one man stepping forward to fire through a prepared opening, another man ready to take his place, a third keeping watch on a second angle so no shooter could creep into position unnoticed. Smoke and dust gathered inside the store with each shot, so men stepped back into deeper rooms after firing, letting the haze drift toward the door rather than hang in their own faces. Every empty casing that hit the floor marked a truth no one needed to say. Ammunition was finite, and the street would punish anyone who ran dry. Across the road, the Montaño position and nearby rooms held Hispano defenders who watched the West End through narrow sight lines. Some had chosen spots that gave a long view of the street, while others watched alleys and yard edges where a man might try to slip forward under cover of a fence. They spoke in short phrases and hand signals because sound carried in wind and echoed off adobe. Each muzzle stayed inside the wall until the instant of a shot, because a rifle barrel, shown too long, was a mark for return fire. At the West End, Sheriff George Pepin's force gathered in its own strongholds. The Wortley Hotel offered porch cover, interior rooms, and a corral to hold horses. The Murphy-Dolan store provided a larger shelter where men could gather, redistribute cartridges, and move between doorways without stepping into open ground. Between them stood the stone torreon, thick-walled and stubborn, with narrow openings that allowed defenders to shoot while staying hidden behind masonry. The torreon protected its occupants from many direct hits, yet its position beside nearby homes also made it a magnet for retaliation. Pepin carried warrants, and those papers gave his side a legal tone even as rifles were brought into play. Deputies were assigned to watch doorways and windows, to hold street corners, and to keep their own men from wandering into crossfire. Riders were sent to locate gunmen who were still outside town, because the West End needed numbers to keep the East End pinned. Orders were shouted, repeated, then repeated again when wind tore words apart. In a place where a man could walk from one end of town to the other in a short time, those shouted orders were the only thing holding loose groups together. A separate threat appeared beside the torreon. Saturnino Bacca, whose home stood close to that stone tower, received a written demand from Alexander McSween. The demand ordered Bacca to vacate the property within 3 days, and it warned that the house could be set on fire if it continued supplying the men occupying the torreon with food and water. Bacca's household was not built for siege, yet it had become attached to one by proximity. The notice placed Bacca under danger from both directions, the tower full of armed men on one side, and the threat of fire on the other. Bacca wrote to Lieutenant Colonel Nathan A.M. Dudley at Fort Stanton asking for protection. Dudley faced strict limits on Army involvement in local conflict, so he did not march troops into Lincoln as an opening move. He sent Lieutenant Daniel Appel instead, an officer tasked with observing, speaking to the parties, and reporting back without turning soldiers into a private posse. Appel rode into Lincoln with dust swirling around his boots, his uniform and horse already coated in grit. He stepped into a town where every doorway and window carried the possibility of a rifle. Appel met with Bacca first, hearing the plea framed in immediate terms: a wife and children living beside a stone tower filled with armed deputies. He then went to McSween. McSween stood by his written demand. He stated plainly that the torreon was being supplied from Bacca's house, and that the men inside the tower were using that supply to hold a fortified position. McSween rejected any arrangement that left the torreon operating as a private stronghold. Appel listened, asked for restraint, and sought a practical way to separate a family home from a gunman's fortress. Appel then spoke with the occupants of the torreon. They refused to abandon the stone tower unless United States troops occupied it and declared it neutral ground. The request sounded orderly, yet it required the very involvement Dudley had not authorized. Appel pressed for any alternative: withdrawal, dispersal, removal of weapons, or relocation into a building that was not welded to a family home. The answer stayed fixed. The torreon would not be surrendered to opponents, and the men inside did not intend to step into the street without a shield stronger than their own walls. Soon after Appel turned back toward Fort Stanton, additional posses arrived from the west, tied to John Kinney, Buck Powell, and Marion Turner. They rode in with rifles ready and moved fast as soon as their horses were thrown into the Wortley corral. Saddle leather creaked, spurs scraped, and men spread to firing points as if the town had already been divided into sectors. The first rounds cracked toward the McSween house, aimed to pin heads down and force defenders to stay behind adobe. Bullets struck dirt, slapped into wood and chipped walls, turning small bits of adobe into stinging shrapnel. From the Montano position, Billy Bonney moved with several men straight into the open to reinforce the McSween house. The distance was short, yet it was bare, with no wagon, no ditch, no tree line to shield a sprint. The men ran hard, bodies leaning forward, knees pumping, firing as they moved to disrupt the shooters at the west end. A round snapped past close enough to cut air beside a cheek. Another struck adobe and burst it, sending grit into eyes. The runners reached the doorway of the McSween house and disappeared inside, pulling the door shut behind them while dust swirled through the crack at the threshold. The first death of the day came in a corral. A horse at the Wortley corral took a bullet and collapsed into dust and manure, legs folding as if the ground had been yanked away. Its breathing turned loud and frantic, then faded into silence. Men stepped around the carcass while continuing to fire because the street had no space for pauses. The dead animal became a marker of how random the fight had become, a warning that any exposed movement could be hit, even movement that carried no rifle. With surprise gone, Pepin and James Dolan returned to the warrant language and tried to force a surrender through procedure. Deputy Jack Long was ordered to approach the McSween house and announce that he was there to serve warrants on the men inside. Long walked forward with his voice raised so the words would carry through wind and powder haze. He reached a point where the slits in the sacks and the narrowed windows could see him clearly. The answer was a sudden burst of gunfire from the house. Long turned and ran for cover, cutting back toward the west end without finishing his demand in any form that mattered to the men behind the wall. After that attempt, the fight settled into sustained exchange. Men fired at window edges where a shadow shifted, at door cracks where a muzzle appeared for a blink, and at porch posts where they believed a shoulder had pressed too close. Adobe absorbed many bullets, yet close shots punched into softer brick and opened fresh craters. Each crater became a new notch for a rifle barrel, and each notch increased the chance that a later shot would find a gap leading into flesh. Black powder smoke mixed with dust, making the street look hazy even in daylight, and the smell of sulfur clung to clothing, hair, and the backs of throats. In the Ellis store, discipline kept men alive. A shooter fired, then stepped back, and another man took the opening, changing the rhythm so an opponent could not time a return shot to a single face. Cartridges were counted by touch. Repeaters allowed quick volleys, yet each volley consumed ammunition at a brutal pace. The defenders learned to wait for clear targets, a hat brim, a shoulder, a boot, then fire once and withdraw. A man who fired without purpose filled the air with noise and emptied his belt without changing the fight. Inside the McSween house, the defenders managed heat, exhaustion, and fear in practical ways. Rifles grew hot and were swapped when possible. Sandbags were checked after impacts and shifted where bullets had torn fibers and spilled sand. Loose sand was packed back into gaps by hand. Men spoke in short instructions, warning of a muzzle flash, calling out a corner that needed watching, telling a wounded man to stay low. No one stood upright in a street-facing room. When someone crossed a space, he did it crouched, pressing close to the wall so the thick adobe would take any stray round. Non-combatants in Lincoln were trapped in the same narrow geometry as the gunmen. Families pressed into interior rooms, away from windows, away from door cracks that could draw around. Some moved between buildings during brief lulls, running from one porch shadow to the next, then flattening against a wall when firing resumed. Water became a daily need compressed into dangerous minutes. A bucket had to be filled and carried without stepping into a line of fire. A child's cry risked drawing attention toward a house that wanted to be invisible, and mothers tried to keep hands over mouths while bullets snapped outside. The wind kept punishing every plan. Dust stayed suspended and made it hard to see a shooter's face at distance. Sunlight reflected off pale adobe and bleached the street. Heat rose off roofs and porches and turned mouths dry. Each rifle discharge inside a room pushed smoke into corners and across faces, turning breath into a bitter taste. Horses stamped and snorted in corrals, reacting to the sharp cracks and the smell of powder. Even men with steady hands felt their fingers stiffen from grit and sweat mixing together. By late afternoon, wounded men accumulated on Pepin's side. Shots that struck arms, shoulders, thighs, and hands did not always kill. Yet they removed rifles from the line and forced others to take more openings. Bandaging was improvised with torn cloth, pressure, and belts tightened into makeshift tourniquets. The Wortley Hotel's interior became a place where injured men lay on floors and beds while others stepped past them to reach firing points. The smell of blood mixed with smoke, and flies found it quickly in the summer heat. The defenders at the McSween house held through the day without losing a man in the opening exchange. Yet that fact brought no calm. Each strike on the outer wall showed how thin the margin was. A bullet that hit a different inch of adobe could reach a throat or a temple through a gap. Men kept their faces away from openings and listened for the distinct sound of a shot passing close, a crack sharper than the dull thud of an impact on wall. They conserved water, ate in brief bites, and stayed in position because moving wrong in a closed house was as dangerous as moving wrong in the street. As daylight faded, the exchange of fire became uneven. A volley erupted when someone believed he saw movement at a corner, then stopped when the target vanished. Shouted insults crossed the street and broke apart in wind. Smoke drifted in thin sheets, then cleared, replaced by dust that made eyes water. In the Wortley corral, the dead horse drew flies before darkness fully arrived. And the living horses shifted and stamped, ears flicking with each report. The first day ended without a decisive break, and men on both sides understood that morning had only opened a longer trap. Night changed the fight instead of stopping it. Shooting became sporadic, single shots spaced apart, each one a test, each answer a warning. Men tried to rest with rifles across their chests, yet sleep came in fragments interrupted by the creak of a floorboard or the scrape of a boot. Inside the McSween house and in the West End buildings, men lay in cramped positions and listened to silence that kept every sense sharp. The wind softened, but the street stayed sealed between armed walls, and the first day closed with no surrender, no safe crossing, and no clear path except to endure the next sunrise. Tuesday, July 16, 1878. Morning light reached the roofs and porches of Lincoln, and rifles started again while the ground still held the night's coolness. Men who had slept in their boots rose from dirt floors, from benches, from bare planks behind counters, and from corners where they had taken turns keeping watch. When the first shots rang out, bodies pressed down behind adobe and timber. Rifles lifted, sights found narrow openings, triggers squeezed, then heads dropped back behind cover before return fire could find them. The street stayed empty. Nothing crossed the open ground except dust, shaken loose each time a bullet struck a wall or shaved splinters from a doorframe. Grit floated and settled on eyelids and lips. Smoke drifted out of firing slits and broken windows, then thinned during lulls, then returned when another burst began. The sound never held steady. It came in short surges, then slackened into single cracks, then rose again as nerves tightened and someone decided not to wait for a clearer shot. On the western end, the posse kept to the thickest cover. Men hugged adobe corners, crouched behind low walls, and used the Wortley Hotel and nearby buildings as shields. They shifted positions by inches. A rifleman slid along a wall until his shoulder found a corner, lifted the barrel just high enough to see a slice of street, and fired at a shadow across the way. The instant he fired, he dropped flat because answers came quickly, chewing adobe at head height and throwing dust into faces and mouths. Across the street, the defenders relied on construction and patience. Adobe absorbed lead and resisted penetration. Bullets punched holes, sprayed grit, and sometimes lodged in the clay. The defenders treated each opening as a deliberate firing point. They widened cracks with knives, cut fresh slits, and packed sand and loose earth behind the most exposed gaps. A man set his rifle on a rolled blanket or a board so the barrel would not scrape the edge of the slit and give away his position. He fired, drew the weapon back, reloaded, then waited until the smoke cleared before risking another shot. The second day showed damage to the town itself that could be seen from room to room. Plaster flaked from interior walls in thin sheets. Window frames splintered. Where glass existed, it shattered and fell into rooms in sharp fragments that cut hands and knees. Repeated hits chewed the edges of openings until rectangles became rough holes. The outer surface of adobe chipped away in pale patches, and deeper craters formed where bullets struck the same place again and again. Dust and fragments became the day's constant drift, coating hair, clothing, food, and water, turning every breath into work. Sheriff George Pepin faced the same problem with each hour. He had deputies, hired gunmen, and allies who wanted the defenders crushed, and he had warrants and legal language, yet none of that forced men out of thick-walled rooms. Every attempt to close distance required crossing exposed ground. Exposed ground meant a man could be hit before he reached the next cover. Pepin could keep men firing and keep pressure on windows, but he could not order a rush without accepting bodies left in the street, and he knew that the dead would be read as weakness by the living on both sides. James Dolan watched the stalemate with impatience. He had men willing to shoot and men who had ridden to Lincoln expecting a final settlement. Instead, the day became a grind measured in smoke and cartridges. Ammunition began to count. Rifles heated, hands blackened with powder, and tongues stuck to dry mouths. Men tried to conserve by firing only when they believed they could hit a target. Yet the fight pulled them into waste because silence felt like weakness, and every pause invited the fear that the other side was moving, reloading, or slipping a man to a better angle. The weapons themselves shaped the rhythm. Some men held repeating rifles that could throw several shots quickly, and some held single-shot rifles that demanded a careful reload after each discharge. Revolvers stayed close for a rush that never came, the short barrels useful only if someone broke into the open at close range. Black powder smoke made every discharge visible. A man who fired too often filled his own firing slit with smoke and advertised his location. Men learned to fire, withdraw a pace into the room, wait until the air cleared, then return to the opening without presenting the same outline twice. By midday, the besiegers spoke openly on the limits of rifle fire. Thick adobe and short lines of sight protected the defenders from anything except a direct hit through a slit. A cannon, even a small mountain piece, could change the balance. Solid shot could knock corners loose, break openings wider, and force defenders away from their safest rooms. The nearest source of such force sat at Fort Stanton. The soldiers there had artillery, and they had a chain of command that could move it with discipline. Pepin sent word toward the fort requesting a howitzer. The request carried frustration as much as need. A cannon promised the power to reach through walls without asking a man to step into the open. At Fort Stanton, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dudley received the request and refused to loan artillery to a county posse. Federal restrictions limited the Army's role in civilian enforcement, and Dudley would not hand a cannon to one side of a local war and claim he had remained within his orders. The denial was firm, and it came back to Lincoln in the most direct way, on a saddle carried by a soldier who could not soften the message. The refusal traveled back to Lincoln on horseback. Private Barry Robinson carried the message. He rode toward the town on the road that entered from the west, straight toward the cluster of buildings held by Pepin's men. Robinson wore the uniform of the Frontier Army and followed orders that did not come with explanations. He had to ride into a place where rifles were already aimed at anything that moved, and where men judged a moving shape first as a target and only later as a person. A single shot cracked as Robinson neared the western end. The round came close enough to force him down over the saddle. His horse jumped and tried to veer, and Robinson drove it forward because stopping in the open invited a second shot. He reached shelter near the Wortley Hotel, delivered Dudley's message to Pepin, and heard the anger that came back in immediate clipped replies. There would be no loan of a howitzer. No cannon would come down the road for the sheriff to use against the buildings holding the defenders, and the men who had begged for that advantage now stared at one another with a hard awareness that they were still trapped in a rifle fight. The denial fed anger in the western end of town, and anger turned into accusation. Men around Pepin reacted with certainty that did not pause for proof. They took the shot fired at Robinson and turned it into a claim. The defenders had fired on a United States soldier while he carried a message from his commander. Pepin ensured that his report to the fort placed responsibility on the McSween faction. The claim spread quickly because it served a purpose. If the army accepted the story, then the army could enter Lincoln under the cover of investigating an attack on its own, and an investigation could become a foothold that rifles alone could not create. In the street, that accusation changed behavior even before any soldier arrived. Posse men pointed at slits in windows and spoke as if the matter was already settled. Defenders heard the talk in fragments and understood the danger. It was not simply that a messenger had been shot at. It was that the shot could be used to bring blue uniforms into the fight without any cannon being loaned on paper. A complaint written by the sheriff could become a reason for officers to appear in town, and once officers stepped into Lincoln, every civilian gunman would have to decide whether to obey a new authority or to risk being treated as an enemy of the army. Robinson did not remain in Lincoln. He turned his horse and rode back toward Fort Stanton with the same exposed feeling between his shoulders. Behind him, the fight continued, bullets cutting into adobe, splintering wood, and sending dust into the air. Inside the town, the question of who fired the shot did not get answered. It did not have to be answered for the accusation to be repeated. In a siege, a claim that suited the moment could be repeated until it sounded like certainty to every man who needed certainty to keep firing. At Fort Stanton, Robinson reported that he had been fired on while delivering the message. Dudley took the report seriously. A claim of gunfire directed at a soldier on duty gave him grounds to send officers to investigate without declaring that the army had joined either faction. Orders went out for a small party to prepare. Officers checked pistols and carbines, secured papers, and made certain that medical supplies and water could be carried. Saddles were tightened, cinches pulled hard, and horses led out and calmed, because a skittish animal on the road could turn an orderly ride into a wreck before the first question was even asked. Back in Lincoln, the defenders could not see Dudley's orders, but they sensed the shift created by the accusation. The besiegers now had a new tool, the chance to pull federal authority into the street. The defenders also faced a hard reality. They could not control every shot fired in town. They did not know which rifle had sent the round toward Robinson. They did not know whether the shooter had aimed at the messenger or fired at motion without thinking. What they did know was that the story carried back to Fort Stanton could tighten the siege without adding a single new civilian gunman to the street. Inside the defenders' buildings, movement stayed low and careful. Rifles rested on windowsills and on carved slits. Men waited in dim rooms until a target showed itself, then fired and withdrew. The danger came from angles. A bullet that entered through a gap could ricochet off timber or iron and strike someone who thought he was protected. Men shifted bedding, food, and ammunition away from the most exposed walls. They kept faces back from openings because a stray round could tear through cheekbone or jaw and leave a man choking before anyone could drag him away from the line. The presence of women and children within the battle zone forced additional restraint. Non-combatants stayed behind thicker interior walls where possible. Men spoke in low voices to prevent panic from rising. A careless shot could punch through an interior partition and enter a room that had seemed safe a moment earlier. The fight had no clean front line. It was a chain of rooms and porches and corners pressed together along one street, with bullets crossing in both directions, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes skipping off hard surfaces and turning into unseen threats inside spaces that were already crowded. As afternoon advanced, the sun heated the street until dust became fine powder that clung to sweat. Gunpowder smell mixed with animal odor and the sharp scent of fresh split wood. Flies gathered wherever they found moisture, on canteen mouths, on eyelids, on the edges of lips. Men swallowed thick saliva and tried not to waste water. Any trip for water required movement under threat. A man crouched, waited for a lull, then rushed a short distance, and every rush drew shots that struck walls and kicked up bursts of clay that sounded like fist blows against a house. The besiegers tried to improve their odds by testing new angles. A rifleman crept to a different corner and fired down the street in a line that had not been used earlier. The defenders answered by watching for muzzle smoke and for the subtle motion of a hat brim or a sleeve. A flash at a window could draw a countershot within seconds. Often the countershot struck nothing but adobe, but even a miss had force. Splinters flew, grit filled the air, and the sound of impact kept everyone flattened. Men learned to avoid standing upright in any room that faced the street because bullets arrived without warning and did not care whether a man was armed or only passing through. By late afternoon, the openings of the McSween house showed heavy damage. 2 windows were shot out until their edges stood raw and uneven. Interior air carried constant dust from bullet impacts. Men covered mouths with cloth to keep from choking, and every breath still carried grit. Coughs were suppressed until they broke loose, sharp and sudden, and when a man coughed, others glared because noise carried and noise drew attention. Powder smoke and clay dust turned throats raw and left a bitter taste that water could not fully wash away. No one died on the second day. The siege still hurt people. Splinters tore skin, fragments stung eyes, and bullets struck close enough to leave ringing ears and shaking hands. But death did not come with daylight's end. The lack of bodies did not mean the fight had eased. It meant the walls held, the shooters stayed low, and every man learned how fast a head could be taken off a window line. The town absorbed punishment while the factions measured one another and waited for some change that would break the balance. Toward evening, firing thinned. Barrels cooled. Men wiped fouling from rifles with scraps of cloth and oil when they had it. Some counted cartridges and kept the number to themselves. Strength was judged in rounds, not in speeches. In the brief quiet, other sounds rose, a mule braying behind a wall, boards creaking under a knee, distant voices carried along the valley. Those sounds did not ease tension. They only showed how close normal life remained to the place where men waited to shoot again. The accusation tied to Robinson's ride did not fade with the daylight. It was repeated on the western end, carried from man to man, spoken as if already proven. Pepin and Dolan needed more than rifles. If the army accepted the story that a soldier on duty had been fired on, then military officers could enter Lincoln under the cover of investigation. Once officers entered, their presence could reshape the fight by setting new rules for movement, by intimidating civilians who still believed they could act without consequence, and by turning the siege into something that felt less like a local standoff and more like a contest under federal eyes. The second day ended with both sides still in place, still armed, and now facing a change that did not come from any rifle barrel in Lincoln. It came from the words carried back to Fort Stanton, and from the orders those words set in motion. Night cooled the street. Shots fell to single cracks spaced far apart, then stopped. No rush came under the dark. Men stayed awake, listening, waiting for morning and waiting for the arrival of officers whose decisions could turn a stalled siege into a tighter trap. Wednesday, July 17th, 1878. Before sunrise, the south ridge above Lincoln was dark and cool, and the street below was silent in a way that never lasted. Sheriff George Pepin wanted the riflemen in the Montano store pinned down, and he wanted a clear advantage before the town fully woke. He selected 5 men and sent them up the hills behind the south side of town with a simple order: get above the store, fire into it, and keep firing until the men inside stopped using it as a strong point. The 5 climbed in single file, keeping space between them so one shot could not hit 2 men. They moved with rifles held close and muzzles angled down to avoid catching first light. Stones shifted under boots and rattled down the slope, and every small sound felt loud enough to draw a bullet. The village gave no birds and no dogs. It gave only a faint clink from tack in a corral, and once, the short click of a rifle action being worked somewhere behind a wall. Charlie Crawford climbed with the group. The Tunstall side had labeled him Lolly Cooler, and the name stuck so hard that many people rarely used his given name. He was heavy and winded from the grade, yet he refused to quit. Lucio Montoya stayed close, watching the ridgeline ahead and then looking back toward the roofs as if he expected a rifleman to already be tracking them. The other 3 spread out in a loose line as the slope opened, one to the east, one to the west, and one slightly lower to watch the path below them. They reached a rock outcrop and crouched behind it, peering down at Lincoln's single street and the blocky shapes of adobe buildings. Many windows were covered with boards. Some doors were shut and reinforced from the inside. Clay walls showed fresh chips and pale scars where lead had struck and broken away the surface. In the half-light, the town looked like a place abandoned in haste, yet the hillsmen understood it was full of men who were waiting for targets. The first light came slowly, then widened across the valley. The men expected immediate return fire from the Montano store, yet the building stayed still. No figure moved at its openings. No muzzle flash winked from the roofline. The quiet suggested a retreat. It also suggested a trap, and a trap still tempted men who wanted the day to turn in their favor. Crawford shifted to get a clearer view. He rose higher than the others, trying to see whether the store's windows showed shadowed movement or empty space. The instant he exposed more than his hat brim above the rock, a single rifle report cracked from the direction of the store. The bullet struck Crawford through the hips and tore into his spine. His legs failed immediately. He folded and hit the ground hard, hands clawing at gravel. Then went still as blood soaked the cloth at his waist and seeped into the dust. Montoya dropped flat behind the rock and tried to locate the shooter by sound. Echoes bounced between ridge and town, making direction hard to read. The hillside offered little cover once a rifleman had the range. The other 3 men looked at Crawford's lower body and saw it was useless. They understood that staying meant another shot, then another, until the hillside held 2 bodies instead of 1. They pulled back in a crouch, then in a scramble, then in a run, sliding down loose soil and keeping below the ridgeline. Montoya reached the lower ground and did not stop until walls blocked the line of fire. His throat burned from dust. When he spoke, the report was blunt and short. Crawford had been hit hard. Crawford could not move. Crawford was still up there. Men around Pepin heard the last part and stared toward the slope, trying to locate a shape in the glare. Some wanted to rush to him. Others knew that a rescue party would be forced to climb into open view with no cover. Pepin's men tried to watch the slope without exposing themselves. A few pressed their faces to narrow gaps between boards and adobe, using the darkest corners to hide their outlines. From there, they could sometimes pick out a limp shape and the small twitch of an arm. Each time Crawford moved, a new shout went up, then died, because no one could answer it with action. Riflemen checked angles and hesitated, knowing that any man who stepped into the open would be framed against the pale ground. A runner was sent toward Fort Stanton with the blunt message that the fight in Lincoln had reached a point where civilians and soldiers were being dragged into it. The man kept low where he could, then broke into a hard run when the ground opened. Behind him, shots continued at irregular intervals. Nobody in town expected mercy from distance. They expected only that someone somewhere would fire again when a target rose above cover. On the south slope, Crawford's condition shifted from shock to panic and then to a dull endurance. His fingers grew stiff from gripping rock. He could not feel his feet at all, yet he could feel the raw burning at the hips where blood and grit mixed. The sun climbed higher, and heat pressed into him until his breath came in short bursts. The defenders inside the Montano store did not need to see Crawford closely to know what the shot had achieved. The sudden silence on the hillside told them the five had fled. Herrera kept his rifle close to the opening and waited for a second target, but none appeared. The building's walls and narrow sight lines offered a ruthless advantage. A man behind them could choose when to expose only a barrel and a hand, then vanish again before return fire could find the same place twice. Inside the Montano store, Fernando Herrera held the window angle that faced the south slope. Herrera was a Basque, and accounts tied him by marriage to Doc Scurlock. He waited behind the protection of thick walls in a narrow opening and fired once with care, selecting the moment when Crawford stood up to look. The shot did not merely wound. It wrecked the spine and removed the use of the legs, leaving a man alive yet trapped on a hillside. Crawford lay where he fell. He tried to drag himself toward shade, yet the scrub offered nothing large enough to cover him. He pulled with his hands and elbows, cutting grooves through grit and rock. Each effort tore pain through the wound and forced sound out of him that was not speech. His hat had fallen away. Sunlight hit his scalp directly as the day warmed and baked. Flies arrived, drawn by blood. They landed, lifted, and landed again, and he could not swat them away for long without exhausting himself. Hours on the hillside felt longer than hours behind a wall. Crawford's mouth dried until his lips cracked. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. When he tried to call down toward town, the words came out thin and rough. He could hear distant rifle shots and bursts of shouting from the street. He could also hear nothing for long stretches, the kind of silence that makes a man focus on his own breathing and on the pulse that pounds behind the ears. Pepin's men tried to cover the slope with their own fire. They shot toward the store's openings and toward the Patron house, trying to keep heads down and buy a moment for someone to climb. The angle worked against them. Any man who left the protection of walls would be seen against the sky as he climbed, and a rifleman in a shaded opening could wait until that climber had nowhere to go. Several men paced behind cover, hands flexing on rifle stocks, trapped by the knowledge that courage did not change geometry. The sight of a wounded man left in open ground cut into the town's civilians as well. People sheltered behind interior walls and listened for shots, yet some of them also watched the slope through cracks in boards. They saw the motionless shape and understood that a person could be hit, and then left to cook in the sun because the street's killing ground extended past the buildings. It was not only Main Street that could not be crossed. The hills themselves could become part of the fight. Before noon, word of the wounded man and the morning's shooting reached Fort Stanton alongside complaints that gunfire in Lincoln had threatened soldiers. Captains George Purington and Tom Blair rode toward Lincoln with Lieutenant Daniel Appel and several troopers. They entered a town that did not pause for uniforms. Shots snapped from hidden places as soon as riders moved into view. The troopers shifted along walls, horses turned so their bodies could be partly shielded by buildings. Appel watched fresh chips appear on adobe where rounds struck, each impact throwing pale dust into the air. The officers met Pepin and listened to claims and explanations, yet Crawford pulled their attention outward. From certain spots in town, the hillside was visible, and the wounded man could be seen without effort. Appel did not treat Crawford as a problem to discuss later. He treated him as a man who was dying in slow stages, and he insisted on a rescue. Blair agreed. 2 troopers volunteered, and the 4 prepared to climb in full view of men who had already proven they could hit targets at distance. They moved up the slope in short dashes, then dropped low, then moved again. Loose rock shifted under boots. Dry weeds snagged trouser legs. As they climbed, shots came from the Montagno store and from the Patron house. Dirt jumped near Appel's boots. A round struck rock and shattered it, sending fragments into the air. The rescuers did not stop to return fire. Their purpose was extraction. Any pause to shoot would keep them exposed on the hillside longer. When they reached Crawford, they found him conscious, drenched in sweat and coated with dust. His eyes had the fixed look of a man forced to stare at sky and endure pain without control. Appel spoke to him in quick, direct sentences, telling him what they were going to do and warning him to keep his arms still. Crawford tried to nod, and the small motion jolted his body hard enough to draw a gasp. Appel took Crawford's wrist, gauged the pulse, and looked at the soaked clothing. He could see paralysis. He could see shock creeping in at the edges of the man's face. He could not repair the injury on that slope, yet he could stop the sun and flies from finishing the work the bullet had started. Blair and the troopers slid their arms under Crawford's shoulders and back, and the first lift forced a cry out of him as the wound shifted. They adjusted grip and lifted again. Crawford's legs hung without response. His weight dragged against their arms and made their hands slip on sweat and dried blood. They carried him down in careful steps, balancing his body against the slope's pull. Shots continued from below. A bullet snapped overhead, then struck farther down the hill with a dull thud. One trooper slipped and nearly lost his footing, and Appel tightened his hold to keep Crawford from tumbling. The descent felt longer than the climb. Every step had to be placed. Every pause risked another shot. Blair kept his head down and eyes forward, refusing to look toward the openings that were firing at them. The troopers moved with shoulders hunched, trying to reduce the target their backs presented. When they reached lower ground and the protection of walls, their arms shook from strain and from the tension of expecting impact that never came. Crawford was moved into shelter and then placed into transport for Fort Stanton's post hospital. Lincoln could not offer safe medical care while rifles still ruled the street. The trip out of town was rough. Each bump and sway forced movement at the wound, and Crawford's face tightened with pain each time the wagon jolted. Appel stayed close enough to judge whether the man was fading, and he pushed the escort to keep moving until the post was reached. When Appel and the others carried Crawford down, the officers kept repeating the same instruction: no one fires unless forced. Each shot from the town risked turning soldiers into a third faction, and the officers knew they would be blamed regardless of which direction their bullets traveled. The troopers clenched their rifles anyway because instinct and training pulled them toward retaliation. They held back and focused on footing, on keeping the wounded man upright, on making it to shelter without dropping him. At Fort Stanton, Crawford was taken into the post hospital where order replaced the chaos of the street. Appel could finally examine the wound with light and tools, yet the damage was already clear. Paralysis meant the bullet had broken vital pathways. Infection and shock were threats that grew with each hour. Crawford drifted between wakefulness and blank stares, sometimes trying to sit up, then collapsing when his lower body did not answer. The staff cleaned the wound, eased his thirst, and watched his pulse for signs of collapse. The gunfire in Lincoln did not end because Crawford left the hillside. Men on both sides continued to fire at movement, sound, and muzzle flashes. Boards over windows turned buildings into dark boxes with thin cracks for sighting. Rifles were rested on sills, on stacked lumber, on folded cloth, anything that steadied a barrel. A man who stepped into a yard could be seen from a roofline or an upper window and hit before he completed a second step. The officers did not stay long in the street. Their presence had not created control. It had shown that the town's fight could reach the army and even draw fire onto rescuers. As the day moved into late afternoon, the shooting thinned, then flared again in quick exchanges, as if each side tested whether fading light would allow movement. Inside each position, men wiped sweat from hands, checked rifles, and rationed water in small swallows, knowing that thirst could ruin aim as surely as fear. Crawford did not recover. The wound had destroyed his lower body and left him in constant pain. He died at Fort Stanton on Tuesday, July 23, 1878. His death did not stop the violence in Lincoln. It added another name to a list that kept growing, and it proved that the killing ground reached beyond Main Street and into the hills that watched the town. Thursday, July 18, 1878. The first mounted column came in from the Fort Stanton road under hard heat, dust clinging to every boot and every horse's flank. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dudley rode with United States troops and did not move like a town posse. Carbines rested across saddles, pistols rode in regulation holsters, and a Gatling gun came with its mount and feed boxes. A 12-pound mountain howitzer followed on a limber iron fittings wrapped and tied for the ride. Lincoln had become a place where any open doorway could hide a rifle muzzle. Main Street was still the town's spine, yet it no longer felt like a public road. It felt like a line of fire that changed minute by minute. Families watched from behind shutters and from the shadows of adobe rooms, careful not to silhouette themselves in windows. Men sleeping in corners lifted their heads when the soldiers appeared, because the army's presence meant the rules could change without warning. Dudley halted the detachment where the road widened and spread his men out with short commands. Troopers took corners to control movement. Several dismounted and stood with carbines ready, bodies angled to narrow their profile, boots set firm in the dust. Others remained mounted to keep speed available if someone tried to break away. The Gatling gun was set where it could sweep the street, its barrels aligned down the center line. The crew checked the crank, tested the feed, and placed ammunition boxes within arm's reach. The metal looked clean and hard against the town's dirt and soft walls, a signal that a single man's rifle could be answered by a weapon that did not pause to reload. The howitzer was brought forward next. The team swung it into position with a squeal of leather and wood. Then the trail dropped and the wheels were chalked. The crew moved with trained precision. One man laid out the sponge and rammer, another checked the vent, then the lanyard. The gunner eyed the street as if it were a measured range. Powder and projectiles were kept close because the value of artillery is speed and certainty once the order comes. A cannon does not need to fire to reshape a fight. It reshapes a fight by making every defender picture what it can do to adobe, plank, and bone when it strikes at close distance. Dudley took the reason for intervention and used it hard. A report that a soldier had been fired on, whether accurate in every detail or wrapped in rumor, placed the feud under federal authority in his mind. He spoke of the Army's safety and the duty to protect his men. He did not entertain long arguments over local warrants in a town where law had already fractured into rival badges, rival posses, and improvised justice. His warning was plain: no more shooting in the open street, no more shots that crossed the Army's line, and no more men using the town center as a rifle range. Sheriff George Pepin went to meet him. Pepin needed force to keep his position, and he knew the soldiers could become force in his favor without a single deputy firing another round. He spoke with urgency and with the impatience of a man who had watched a siege stretch without a clean resolution. Dudley listened, then turned his attention to what he could see. Lincoln was full of armed men in buildings, and civilians were pinned inside homes with no safe corridor. Dudley's first aim was control, not rescue, control of movement, control of open ground, control of the street where a stray bullet could kill someone who never held a gun. The Ellis store stood as a blunt challenge to that control. It sat in the town's center and had served as a stronghold for regulators who could watch Main Street and answer rifle fire from cover. Dudley did not send men to storm it. He used the howitzer as a lever. The barrel was trained toward the store, not toward a distant ridge. The crew prepared with deliberate speed, hands moving to tools, shoulders settling into positions that signaled readiness. Dudley made his point without decoration. If fire came from that building, the reply would be cannon fire. Inside the Ellis store, the men holding it did not waste time on speeches. A rifle fight rewards patience and steady aim. Artillery punishes buildings. Canister from a 12-pound howitzer can turn a doorway into a burst of flying metal, and a shell can break an adobe wall and scatter fragments like blades. A Gatling gun can pour bullets into an opening faster than a man can react, faster than a hand can work a lever or a bolt. The store's defenders had held their position through repeated exchanges, yet they had not held it against an army weapon aimed straight down the street at their walls. They chose movement. The exit did not look heroic. It looked like survival. Men slipped out by the rear, moving through yards and behind fences, using low walls and outbuildings to break sight lines. Others waited for the moment when a mounted horse blocked a view or a trooper shifted his stance, then crossed a short open space with heads low and rifles tight to the body. A few left their posts one at a time, spacing themselves so a single volley could not cut them all down. Their boots kicked dust, their shoulders hunched, their eyes fixed on the next piece of cover. One man dragged a sack of cartridges by its strap. Another carried a rifle in one hand and a tin cup in the other, leaving bedrolls and spare coats behind. The howitzer never needed to fire. The cannon's muzzle did its work by forcing the defenders to abandon a position that had anchored the contest in the middle of town. The pressure spread outward to other positions held by the Tunstall McSween side. Mexican regulators posted in scattered spots read the soldiers' posture and understood that remaining in visible cover under a howitzer and a Gatling gun would end with bodies in the dust. Their leader, Josefita Chavez, made the same judgment. Men began to peel away by ditches and back lanes, stepping carefully so stones would not clack against boots. Some moved in pairs, one watching while the other crossed open ground, then trading places. They did not argue with the army's hardware. They disappeared into yards, brush, and the uneven ground beyond town. Dudley's troopers did not chase. The soldiers held the line and controlled Main Street because a pursuit could reopen shooting and drag federal troops into a running battle through yards and homes. Dudley wanted open exchanges stopped, and he achieved that by dominating the center of Lincoln, then letting armed men withdraw rather than forcing them into a corner where they might shoot their way out. The trade was simple: fewer shots in the street, fewer wounded civilians, and fewer chances for the town to ignite into a general battle line. The result was not peace. It was a narrowing of the battlefield. The McSween house remained occupied, and it became the single point where the siege could still be finished with blood. With the Ellis store emptied and with other allies slipping away, the men in the McSween house became an island under hard attention. Their support in town thinned, and the soldiers' barrier prevented a return to the earlier pattern of multiple defended positions that could trade covering fire across the road. Inside the McSween house, the defenders lived with the uglier parts of siege work. Water was portioned out in small mouthfuls. poured into chipped cups and passed hand to hand. Food was eaten without appetite, because smoke and stress dull a stomach. The air carried the sting of burnt powder and the oily smell of gunmetal warmed by hands. Men slept in fragments, heads dropping for minutes, then waking to the scrape of a boot or the creak of a settling wall. One defender, Tom Cullens, lay dead after being struck by a stray bullet during the long exchanges, and the living stepped around his space, careful not to trip in tight rooms where every stumble could expose a man to a window. Outside, Pepin's force adjusted fast. With the Ellis store no longer held against them, the besiegers could shift closer to the McSween house without being trapped by fire from the center of town. They moved in short bursts, hugging walls, using adobe corners as cover, then stopping to watch windows and doorways. The Patron house and the Montano store remained key positions for the Murphy-Dolan faction, and men flowed between them and other cover points like water-finding channels. Rifles were rested on sills and corners, then lifted, then lowered again, a constant search for a target, a constant effort to keep the defenders inside from seeing a clean exit. Dudley's troops shaped the street in a way that favored the posse. The soldiers stood between parts of Lincoln and controlled who could cross open ground with weapons. A man running with a rifle in his hands could be treated as an immediate threat to federal troops. That rule sat in posture and in readiness. Carbines were kept in hands, not slung. The Gatling crew stood close to its crank and feed, watching for any group trying to mass and rush. The howitzer remained in place, a fixed reminder that the army could destroy cover instead of trading bullets with it. Civilians felt the change in their bodies. Rifle fire is terrifying, yet it is familiar in a frontier town where men hunt, herd, and settle disputes with guns. A cannon in the street is different. It announces that the dispute can be ended by destroying buildings. Mothers held children close and older men stared at the howitzer as if it were a plague cart. The Gatling gun with its cluster of barrels looked unnatural in Lincoln's dirt road. It belonged to forts and formal battle lines, not to a county seat street lined with stores, homes, and the small rooms where families tried to breathe quietly. Some residents began to think less of who was right and more of what would happen if artillery were finally used, because there was no place to hide if the heavy guns were used. The afternoon stretched under harsh light. Sun baked the walls and turned the dust white. Horses shifted in shade, ears flicking at flies. The Gatling crew stayed near the mount, and the howitzer crew remained close enough to serve the gun in moments. Dudley watched the town and refused to let a stray shot drag his detachment into a full engagement. He held the street, and the line he held kept men from crossing with rifles in their hands. Pepin's men used the calm to set the ground for an ending. They watched the McSween house with narrowed eyes and began to talk less of trading shots and more of forcing the defenders out. Some carried tools for breaking adobe. Others carried bundles that were not blankets or food, dry brush, scrap wood, and cloth that could catch easily. Men walked those bundles behind walls and through backlots, keeping them low. Their faces carried the focus of men preparing for a close job. They wanted the defenders pushed into the open where the posse could kill them, and they wanted the town's center controlled, so no outside help could sprint in with rifles and turn the yard into a crossfire again. Dudley attempted to impose procedure through talk. A meeting was called under the pressure of troops, and voices rose in a room where men tried to speak law in a place that had stopped obeying it. Arguments came in hard bursts, accusations and denials, each man insisting he was the injured party. Dudley listened, then returned to what he could control. He could keep his weapons on Main Street. He could stop armed groups from forming a new firing line across the road. He could threaten anyone who fired across his soldiers. He could keep his detachment in place as a wall that stopped movement. The defenders listened to the meeting's noise from behind their walls and gained no comfort. Reduced shooting did not mean safety. It meant the besiegers had time to plan. The men inside heard movement outside that suggested new positions being taken. They heard the occasional sharp command from a soldier, then the scrape of boots, then silence again. Rifles and pistols were checked by touch in dim rooms. Cartridges were kept close because a man who searches for ammunition dies with empty hands. Each defender picked a place to watch, then changed that place after a few minutes, trying not to be predictable to men outside who watched for a head, an elbow, a flicker of movement behind glass. As the day cooled toward evening, wind came through the valley and carried dust into every seam. The howitzer remained in place and the Gatling gun stayed set, its crank ready. The Army's firepower had already done its work by reshaping the contest. By late day, many of the McSween supporters who had been scattered through town were gone, leaving the defenders in the house with fewer friendly guns in reach. The posse could focus its men without fear that a second regulator strongpoint would open fire and force them to split their attention. Night came with the town still tense and armed. Shadows filled the street and silhouettes of soldiers and possemen blended against adobe. The siege did not end with one loud event. It tightened like a rope. Men outside settled into positions that would hold through darkness. A lantern was shaded and carried low, light kept from spilling onto open road. Instructions were passed in whispers. Watchers stared at black windows and tried to catch the slightest shift of movement inside. Within the McSween house, the defenders faced the plain truth that every route out had been watched and measured. The Army line on the street, the posse positions in buildings, and the men in yards combined into a net. The defenders did not know the exact hour the final move would come, yet they could sense the direction of events. The gunfire that had once surged and faded now felt like controlled pressure, and the town's center was held by soldiers who could turn heavy weapons wherever Dudley pointed. Friday, July 19th, 1878. Sunrise came hard and clear, and Lincoln's main street looked scraped raw, as if the town itself had been scoured by lead and grit. The quiet felt deliberate, not peaceful. Men stayed inside doorways and behind corners, listening for the first shot that would restart the day. On the west end, the McSween home sat scarred and dark, its outer walls cratered, its openings narrowed to slits, its yard stripped of anything that could hide a man crossing it. United States troops held the center of the village and watched the street with carbines ready. Their stance warned that any sudden movement could draw federal rifles, and that warning pushed gunmen deeper into cover. Sheriff George Pepin moved between his men with clipped orders, keeping them in position so no one drifted into the open and became a target for the house. James Dolan stayed close to the west end, watching the building that had resisted every push and every shouted demand. Inside the McSween home, the defenders woke stiff and dirty. Hands were blackened by powder and smeared with clay from packing cracks. The air tasted of smoke that never fully left the rooms. Water had grown warm in buckets and tins, and each swallow had to be shared without argument. Rifles lay within arm's reach, muzzles angled down to keep from showing in the openings. Men spoke in short phrases because sound carried through thin gaps. Susan McSween stayed close to the interior, her clothing marked by soot and dust from constant impacts. In the same cramped spaces were Mrs. Shield and her 5 children, and Miss Susan Gates. Dr. Taylor Ely and his family were trapped in the same end of town, hemmed in by rifle lines, and by the way, every open step outside could draw fire. Children were kept low, away from windows, away from door cracks, away from any place where a stray round could enter without warning. After full daylight, gunfire returned in probing cracks from hidden angles. A rifle discharged from the west end, then another answered from inside the McSween home. Bullets struck adobe with dull thuds and lifted pale dust into the air. Each impact made the walls shed grit that drifted down into hair and food. The smell of burned powder thickened, thinned, then thickened again with each new shot. Colonel Nathan Dudley pressed for a narrow kind of order, control of the street, and removal of women and children from the worst danger. Pepin wanted the house emptied and the defenders taken or killed. The aims overlapped at a single point. Civilians could be pushed out first, leaving armed men inside with no shield but their own walls. The posse began to speak less of papers and more of ending the siege without a rush across open ground. By early afternoon, the decision showed itself in bundles and tools. Dry brush, scrap wood, and cloth were carried behind walls and stacked where flames could be fed. Men moved with the caution of men working under guns. They kept low, used corners, and waited for moments when the defenders' firing slits went quiet. Coal oil was brought in a container that sloshed with each step, and its sharp smell reached the street before a match was struck. The first fire was set against the western end of the McSween structure. A man crouched, poured oil into the dry pile, then touched flame to it and pulled back fast. The brush took with a sudden roar that sounded louder than gunfire in the tight space between walls. Orange light jumped against adobe. Smoke rolled upward, then curled back down as the wind shifted. The possemen withdrew into cover because the defenders answered immediately, firing toward the hands that had brought the flame. The fire did not stay in one corner. It found dry seams and climbed. Heat pressed down from above and embers fell into rooms like biting insects. The defenders tried to slow it with buckets and wet cloth, slapping at sparks and forcing water into cracks where flame had started to creep. Smoke invaded fast and turned the air heavy. Eyes burned. Breathing became shallow because deeper breaths pulled in ash and heat. The posse tightened the ring and kept the work methodical. One set of men fired into openings to keep heads down. Another set fed the blaze with fresh brush and more oil. Others watched the backyard and the side lanes for any sign of a sudden rush. The plan was simple. Turn an adobe home into a furnace, then take the men when they bolted. No one on the outside wanted to trade lives for a doorway charge. Inside, the defenders were forced to split into pairs and small knots, one pair trying to keep fire from taking the roof line. Another pair holding the nearest firing slit, another pair moving children and women away from heat and smoke. Rifles shifted hands and positions. Water ran short. The wet cloth that had slowed sparks became hot and useless. Smoke filled every pocket of the house, settled near the floor, then lifted again when wind pushed through cracks. In the West End, trapped civilians listened as the blaze grew. Dr. Ely's family and Miss Gates kept children low, pressing cloth to mouths when smoke drifted in. The smell of oil and powder filled the yard. A child's cough echoed and adults held them tight, waiting for the moment soldiers would let them move. The troops watched the blaze take hold. They held their line on the street and did not break the posse's control of the West End. Their presence created a channel for civilians to leave without being cut down the moment they stepped outside. The protection was narrow and cold, yet it was the only path open. Men with rifles still watched every crossing, and anyone stepping out too fast or holding a weapon too high could be taken for a threat. As dusk approached, Susan McSween gathered the children and the other women and moved them through choking smoke toward the doorway. Faces were streaked with soot, clothing clung with sweat. Outside, firelight painted the ground in shifting orange, and smoke drifted across the street in thick curtains. Under guard and under pressure, they were allowed to cross away from the burning structure and were taken to the Juan Patron house. The walk was short in distance and brutal in feeling. Each step carried the fear of a stray round, the fear of a spark catching cloth, the fear of a man deciding the passage was over. Mrs. Shield kept her hands tight on her children, guiding them without letting them break into a run that could draw gunfire. Miss Gates steadied a child's shoulder and kept their head low. Susan McSween did not look back, because a glance at the flames could break the focus needed to keep moving. At the Juan Patron house, the civilians were hurried inside and told to stay away from doors and windows. Rooms filled with coughs and whispered directions. Water was rationed in small sips. Dr. Ely checked for burns and shock while the roar outside rose and fell with each collapse. Back at the McSween home, the fire advanced room by room. Metal grew too hot to touch. Smoke turned thick enough that the far corner of a room vanished behind gray. Men pulled shirts over their noses and mouths and tasted burnt cloth with every breath. Tears cut clean lines through soot on cheeks. When a defender coughed, it sounded like tearing cloth, and each cough stole breath needed for running. The defenders were pushed into the kitchen, the last room still holding. Alexander McSween sat low, unarmed. Harvey Morris, weakened by illness, stayed near the interior. Jim French watched the yard through a slit with his pistol ready. Billy Bonney checked the back exit and listened for boots and voices outside. Outside, the posse waited behind cover. They fired short bursts to punish any opening and kept watch on the backyard. In the firelight, faces looked flat and tired. Men shifted their grips, ready for the first runner. By 9 o'clock that night, roof sections began to fail. A loud crack sounded as timbers gave way, then a rush of sparks poured into the night air like a shower of metal filings. Heat forced the men into a tighter cluster. They could no longer stay and shoot. Staying meant suffocation or collapse under falling beams. The kitchen's walls held, yet the ceiling above it groaned, and the corner post vibrated with each new collapse. French and Bonney set the order for leaving. A small group would go first, firing pistols to fill the yard with muzzle flashes and force the nearest posseman to flinch and duck. The rest would follow in the gap created by that sudden violence. The plan depended on speed and confusion, the only weapons left once a building became a furnace. No one promised survival. No one offered comfort. Every man simply took his place. French burst out first, pistol raised, firing as he ran. Bonney followed hard, his own pistol snapping in fast rhythm. Tom O'Folliard and Jose Chavez came after them, staying low, legs pumping, bodies angled to avoid taking a full hit. Muzzle flashes lit faces for split seconds, then darkness swallowed them again. Smoke drifted through the yard and made the runners appear and disappear, as if the ground itself was trying to hide them from the rifles. The posse answered with a wall of gunfire. Rifles cracked from behind fences and corners. Shots came from more than one angle, and the yard became a crossing of sparks and sharp reports. Harvey Morris ran into that fire and was hit once, dropping in the open where dust turned dark beneath him. Another man tripped over debris, caught himself, and kept moving because stopping in the yard meant being finished at close range. Pistol fire from the escaping group kept snapping back, not to win the yard, only to force heads down long enough to cross it. Bonney and the men with him drove forward through the burst of shots and reached cover beyond the immediate yard. Their pistols kept firing until their arms reached protection behind walls and brush. In the confusion, more men slipped away through the darkness in different lines, avoiding the heaviest angles of fire. They ran until their lungs burned and the sound of Lincoln's shots faded behind them. Once the first burst of speed ended, they moved again, cutting across ground that would not show clear tracks and staying out of any open stretch long enough for a rider to line up a shot. Near the burning home, the close-range fighting turned chaotic. Troops moved toward the backyard with orders to take prisoners, then hesitated as gunfire surged at arm's length and forced them to pull back to avoid being hit by stray rounds. Bob Beckwith was in the yard with the posseman, and the exchange became so close and fast that no one had time to sort targets from allies by anything except instinct and silhouette. Alexander McSween stepped out unarmed into the night and was shot down. Francisco Zamora and Vicente Romero were also killed near the yard and outbuildings as they tried to reach cover while the posse fired at anything that moved. Firelight made the scene brutally clear, bodies dropping, dust jumping under bullets, men shouting warnings that came too late. Later examinations recorded 5 bullet wounds on McSween, 1 on Morris, 3 on Romero, and 8 on Zamora. Beckwith also fell dead in the same fighting. A casualty on the attacking side laid down in the dirt near the burning walls he had helped trap. The burning continued without pause. Walls glowed along their edges where timber had burned against adobe long enough to bake it. Roof sections collapsed inward, sending sparks into the night. Smoke filled the yard and made men cough and wipe their faces, yet they kept their weapons up. When the last shots thinned, lanterns appeared and men stepped through debris and ash, turning bodies, kicking rifles away, and checking pockets for cartridges and papers. The smell of scorched cloth hung low, and the heat off the ruins pressed against faces like a hand. Men argued in brief, angry bursts over who should claim which weapon, who had fired the shot that dropped a running man, who had seen a figure slip through the smoke. Someone laughed once, a short sound that turned ugly as soon as it left the mouth. Another man spat into the dust and said nothing at all. The fire crackled and popped behind them, a steady reminder that the fight had ended because a home had been destroyed. Near midnight, the fire consumed what could burn and left a blackened shell. The dead were named in short, hard statements and then left where they fell, because moving them in that heat and smoke felt pointless. Some men began stripping anything usable from the ruins, belts, hats, weapons, because taking property had become part of how the war fed itself. The ground was littered with splintered wood, smashed crockery, and scraps of paper that floated and then settled as ash. In the patron house, the civilians listened to the final shots and then to the change that followed, the way the noise thinned until only the fire remained. Susan McSween held still, hearing the crackle and knowing what it meant for the walls that had protected her husband. Mrs. Shield tried to keep her children from looking out. Dr. Ely kept watch on faces for signs of panic. Miss Gates pressed a child's head to her shoulder and whispered without words, only breath and closeness, because no sentence could cover the night. Beyond the village, the men who escaped regrouped in darkness. They stayed off the open road where riders could track them and used uneven ground and brush to break pursuit. Clothes stank of smoke, hands were slick with sweat and powder residue. Each man checked his weapon by touch, counted remaining cartridges, and listened for horses. No one lingered near the town's edge because a pursuit could come with fresh men and fresh light. Far from the flames, the escapees moved in single file through arroyos and brush, stopping only to listen. When a horse snorted in the dark, every pistol came up. No one spoke names. They saved breath for running toward Rio Bonito. Lincoln Street fell into an exhausted silence as the fire burned down. The siege ended not with a surrender, but with a building destroyed and men killed in the open. The survivors who fled carried the fight out of town in scorched lungs, blackened faces, and the knowledge that the war had turned from a town battle into a hunt across open country.